You fool! Warren is dead. The Shining Hand and Others. 5 Horror Stories by Dick Donovan. The Shining Hand. About the beginning of the present century, Mr. Lawrence Greenwood, commercial traveller and debt collector, left London on a periodical visit to the north, his ground extending as far as Edinburgh and Glasgow, and some of the towns of Fifeshire. Mr. Greenwood represented, and had done for over a quarter of a century, the celebrated firm of Lovell, Boyd and Lovell, who were general merchants and manufacturers. They had a trade which practically extended all over the British Islands, for their goods bore a reputation second to none. However, it is not with the firm we have to deal, but with their representative, Mr. Greenwood. This gentleman was accounted one of the most successful businessmen on the road, and was held in the very highest esteem by his employers. On his outward journeys, he invariably had with him a number of very valuable samples, mainly consisting of jewellery, and when returning he was generally the bearer of considerable sums of money, which he had collected in addition to his samples. Knowing, of course, the risks to which he was exposed from attacks of footpads, highwaymen, and other desperadoes who infested the roads, he was always well armed, and, being an exceedingly powerful man, he was calculated to prove an ugly customer, had anyone ventured to attack him. But, in addition, he was always accompanied by a servant. For some years his servant and travelling companion had been an Irishman named Hugh Dewey, who was conspicuous no less than his master for gigantic physique and dauntless courage. Hugh's probity was supposed to be too powerful for any temptation. In fact, so high did he stand in the estimation of the firm and Mr. Greenwood that they would have trusted him with untold money. It used to be said of Hugh Dewey that he was honesty itself. However, on one occasion when master and man went to the north, Hugh Dewey mysteriously disappeared, and with him a case containing money and valuables to the extent of several £1,000s. And though every means possible were taken to trace him, they proved unavailing, and so the firm suffered the loss, and they expressed themselves in no measured terms against the Irishman. It was during the return journey from Scotland that Dewey disappeared. He and his master had posted from Edinburgh in exceedingly bad weather. They had, in fact, delayed their starting from Edinburgh, owing to the reports of flooded roads and bridges washed away. But as there seemed to be no immediate signs of a change, the travellers determined to face all risks, Mr. Greenwood being very anxious to get home, as one of his daughters was going to be married, and he had promised to be back in time for the wedding. They proceeded without adventure, though not without difficulty, owing to the state of the roads as far as the border. They had come by way of Hawick, as Mr. Greenwood had business in that town, and leaving there in the morning, they had driven by way of Castleton, where they stayed the night, hoping to reach Carlisle the next day. The day broke, however, with a deluge of rain, and so bad were the roads that rapid progress was impossible. In fact, in some parts the River Liddle, which is skirted by the road, had overflowed its banks and greatly added to the danger that beset the travellers. At that time, the road between Castleton and Carlisle was exceedingly wild, and was difficult to traverse even in good weather, for it was badly kept, the traffic being small. But in such weather as then prevailed, none but hardy travellers with pressing business would have ventured to use it. "There is one thing," remarked Mr. Greenwood to his companion. "We are not likely to be troubled with any gentleman of the road." "Indeed, no, sir," exclaimed Hugh. "But even if they were to pay us any attention, I'd fight till the last ounce of me blood, knowing what's in the box. By me faith, but if one of the rascals got hold of that, he might retire from business and live comfortably for the rest of his days. If I had as much as is in there, I'd go home to me native place and marry swate Catherine O'Flanagan. Hurrah, how me mouth wathers when I think of her with a potato patch and the pigs and the small farm." "Why, if she has a farm," exclaimed Mr. Greenwood, "you should lose no time in marrying her. You and she would do well with a small farm between you. Faix, sir, she wouldn't have me unless I'd some money of me own. You see, she's a widdy, and she's the most beautiful creature that ever the sun shone on. While as for offers of marriage, she gets 2 and 3 every blessed day of her life. But she's true to me, and says she, 'Hugh,' she says, 'when you've a small fortune to put to mine, we'll get married, but not before. Be the powers, though, I don't see how I'm to get the fortune except by a windfall.'" When the subsequent events happened that I shall relate, Mr. Greenwood remembered this conversation, and it caused him to entertain suspicion against Hugh that otherwise he would not have done. In spite of every effort they made to reach Carlisle that day, they found themselves towards the evening in the exceedingly lonely neighbourhood of the Solway Moss. A few miles ahead was the little place called Longtown, where they might have got good accommodation for the night, but not only was their horse knocked up with the unusual exertion it had gone through with the heavy roads, but to proceed in the dark would have been to court disaster. They therefore resolved to stay at a hostelry called the Bell, which stood back from the road a little, and at the very head of the moss. The house did not bear the best of reputations, though the worst that had been urged against it was that it was the resort of smugglers who used to run cargoes of French brandy, tobacco, and laces up the Solway Firth. This might or might not have been true, though the probabilities were in favour of its being true. The situation of the house was lonely in the extreme. There was no other habitation near for a considerable distance, and the Bell was exposed to every air from heaven, while the terrific gales that blew up the Firth beat so furiously on it that had the foundation not been good, it must have been blown down. The Bell was in the occupation of a man by the name of Chisholm. The family consisted of the father and mother, who were well advanced in years, and 3 sons, the youngest 23, the oldest about 30. They were stalwart fellows, and by no means prepossessing, for they were very dark-complexioned and much weather-beaten, owing to their calling of fishermen, and no doubt they led very hard lives. Mr. Greenwood had once before stayed in the house, and the old people had made him as comfortable as they could. On that occasion, the 3 sons were away with their boat in the Firth, so that Mr. Greenwood did not see them. On arriving now, however, the 3 young men were at home, and at once busied themselves in unharnessing the horse, while the youngest of the 3 lifted the case of treasures out of the vehicle. Though Mr. Greenwood met him at the door and relieved him of his burden, the young man remarking, "That box is pretty heavy, sir. There is something valuable in there, I warrant." To this Mr. Greenwood vouchsafed no reply, but handed the box to his servant Hugh, who at once carried it upstairs to his room. The old couple lost no time in preparing a hot supper for the weary travellers, while the horse was well rubbed down by the young men, fed with the bran mash, and warmly stabled for the night. Mr. Greenwood, having assured himself of this, for he was very considerate of his beast, ordered a large bowl of hot spiced ale with eggs in it, and invited all the family to partake of some with him. He retired upstairs to his room about 10 o'clock. Hugh Dewey's room adjoined his, and he found that the precious box had been taken into his servant's room. "You had better bring the box to me, Hugh," he said, as he prepared to divest himself of his boots. "Sure, sir. It's as safe with me as it is with you," answered Hugh. Mr. Greenwood, who was very tired and a little drowsy through the hot ale he had consumed, offered no objection to his servant retaining the box in his room, and having looked to the priming of his pistols and placed them under his pillow, he undressed, blew out the light, tumbled into bed, and was soon sound asleep in spite of the gale that was storming round the house, and the heavy rain that lashed the windows as if intent on shivering the glass to atoms. Mr. Greenwood did not wake very early. He had slept the sleep of the just, and awoke much refreshed and strengthened. The gale had abated, but the morning was sullen and gloomy, and a thick mist wreath was lying over the moss and stretching out to the firth. Mr. Greenwood noted these things as, jumping out of bed, he drew aside the curtains of the little window, and looking at his massive gold repeater watch, saw, to his surprise, that it was 10 o'clock. "By Jove, I'm late," he mused, "and must get beyond Carlisle today." Then he hammered on the wall with the bootjack and sung out, "Aye, Hugh there! Turn out, man, it's 10 o'clock." Mr. Greenwood now became absorbed in his toilet, so that 10 minutes elapsed before he remembered that Hugh had not responded. So he went to the servants' room, pushed open the door, and found that Hugh was not there. The fellow's up," muttered Mr. Greenwood, as he returned to finish his toilet. "But why the deuce didn't he call me?" 10 minutes later, Greenwood descended, and the first person he met was the old woman. "Have you seen my servant?" he asked. "No, sir. I didn't even know that he was about." "Dear me, that's strange. I suppose he's outside somewhere. Well, just tell your sons, will you, to put the horse into the chaise at once. I must be off as soon as I've swallowed a mouthful of breakfast." "Well, the lads are away to the fishing, but my old man will do it." At that moment, the old man entered the house, bringing in some wood for the fire. "Have you seen that servant of mine, Mr. Chisholm?" asked Greenwood. "'Deed no, master. I thought he was still in his bed." This reply caused the first suspicious thought to flash across Mr. Greenwood's mind, and, turning hastily, he ran upstairs to Hugh's room to look for the precious box, but he looked in vain. It was gone. Mr. Greenwood became white and red by turns. "My God!" he exclaimed. "The vagabond has sneaked off with the valuables." Mr. Greenwood could not be blamed for this thought, for Hugh's disappearance, taken in connection with his remarks of the previous evening, was certainly a strong piece of circumstantial evidence. In great distress, Mr. Greenwood ran downstairs and questioned the old people. They both expressed the greatest surprise and distress, and said that the lads had gone off about 4 o'clock when the wind went down, and, as far as the old people knew, the doors were safely barred and bolted at that hour. Although Mr. Greenwood had his own thoughts about the sons, he did not express any suspicions, but, without waiting for his breakfast, he went off as fast as his horse would take him to Carlisle. He immediately lodged a complaint with the authorities in that city, and some of the city officers at once returned with him to make an investigation on the spot. The result of that investigation was to satisfy him that the 3 sons had really gone to the fishing at 4 o'clock in the morning, that Hugh was not with them, and that they had not aided him to get away. The conclusion arrived at, therefore, was this: Hugh had made his way to the shores of the Firth, and with some of the money he obtained from the box, he had hired a cutter to take him over to Ireland. The officers promised to try and get confirmation of this supposition, and Mr. Greenwood pursued his journey to London with all possible speed, his faith in human nature very much shaken, for he had hitherto considered Hugh Dewey to be the prince of honest fellows. Mr. Greenwood's firm used every possible means to obtain tidings of Hugh, a Bow Street officer being sent over specially to Ireland to the man's native place, but it was soon placed beyond doubt that Dewey had not gone there, so that his disappearance was wrapped in a great deal of mystery. 6 months later, we find Mr. Greenwood again journeying to the north in company with a new servant, upon whom, however, he kept a very watchful and jealous eye. He resolved to spend a night at the Bell on his way up, his idea being to severely question the Chisholms about Hugh's disappearance, for, in spite of the investigation that had been made, he could not banish from his mind a shadowy suspicion that they could, if they liked, help to clear up the mystery. In fact, it had grown upon him during the months that had passed that the sons, if not the old people, had been party to Hugh's flight, and it was Mr. Greenwood's intention, if he saw the slightest signs to justify his suspicions, to have the Chisholms arrested and subjected to legal cross-examination. The weather was very different now to what it was when Mr. Greenwood had last been at the Bell. Summer was smiling over the land, and the moss was redolent of heather and wild flowers, while bees and butterflies flitted about in the glad sunshine. He arrived in the afternoon, and it struck him that the old people were by no means glad to see him. The sons were away with their boat, he was informed, but they were expected home in the course of the evening. The sun went down in a burst of splendour, sending up from the distant firth flashes of light that glowed on trees and shrubs with a dazzling radiance. Then the twilight succeeded, gradually deepening to purple and darkness, and in the cloudless heavens the stars shone with a galaxy of glory. At 11 o'clock, the sons had not returned, and as the old people expressed an opinion that they were now not likely to return that night, Mr. Greenwood, feeling very disappointed, retired to rest. He did not sleep at first, but lay thinking and wishing that he could solve the mystery of Hugh Dewey. He had been very fond of the fellow, and to be deceived in him like this cut him to the quick. As he thus lay pondering, the moon rose full and round, filling the room with subdued light. Mr. Greenwood sprang out of bed, looked at his watch, noting that it was 12:30. Then he drew aside the curtain and peered out. The night was glorious. The sky was a brilliant splendor of stars, and the pale silver of the moon threw a weird sheen over the landscape, away in the east the firth glittering like a polished shield. As Mr. Greenwood gazed on the witching scene, he observed what he took to be a will-o'-the-wisp flitting about in the moss. It did not flit far, however, but hovered over a particular spot, and presently, to Mr. Greenwood's imagination, it assumed some outline resemblance to a human hand. He was not without superstition, and had a considerable belief in supernatural visitations, for railways and telegraphs had not yet chased ghosts and hobgoblins from their favourite haunts. "I declare it's a corpse-light," muttered Mr. Greenwood with a slight shudder, and dropping the curtain he sprang into bed, and perhaps he did pull the clothes up somewhat unusually high about his face. However, he soon fell asleep, but how long he slept he was never able to say. He woke up with a strange sense of chilliness, although the night was warm, almost sultry, and as he became fully conscious to his surroundings, an uncanny creepiness thrilled him, as he saw with amazement that the will-o'-the-wisp, or corpse-light as he had called it, had come into the room, and was distinctly visible, notwithstanding the effulgence of the moon. Mr. Greenwood was undoubtedly a brave man where things earthly were concerned, but he honestly confessed to a shrinking that was akin to fear in regard to the inexplicable. As he rubbed his eyes now to assure himself that he was really awake, he saw before his astonished gaze a distinct and perfect hand with part of the wrist. It was bright and shining, and seemed to glow with a metallic radiance. When he first saw it, it was perfectly still, floating seemingly over the foot of the bed. But presently it moved very slowly, and with a gliding, graceful motion to the door, and without a sound it drew back the bolts, turned the key, threw open the door, and pointed its index finger into the abysmal blackness of the outer passage. If Mr. Greenwood's hair did not altogether stand erect on his head, a cold perspiration did most certainly break out, and stream down his body, as he gazed like one hypnotized on this phantom hand. What did the phenomenon portend? At that moment, Mr. Greenwood made no attempt to explain the mystery, but sat bolt upright, staring with fixed eyes on the shining hand, which was now motionless, with the finger still pointing to the passage. Mr. Greenwood could never tell how long he remained staring in a state of awed fascination at that wonderful sight. But suddenly it seemed to him that he must at all hazards make an attempt to solve the mystery, and he sprang out of bed. Then the hand floated slowly into the passage, and, like one who was drawn on by some irresistible magnetic influence, he followed. At the end of the passage was a rough ladder or stairway, used to gain access to a garret by means of a trap-door in the ceiling. The hand floated up these steps with the index finger pointing upward. Still under the influence, Mr. Greenwood mounted the ladder, pushed aside the trap, entered, and found himself in an extensive loft, with the roof sloping down on each side. The place was obviously a receptacle for a heterogeneous collection of lumber. There were old fishing nets, broken oars, cork floats, pieces of ropes, broken boxes, heaps of paper, and other things of a like sort. There was a skylight in each side of the roof, and these two skylights admitted a great deal of the moonlight, but there were corners necessarily which were shrouded in shadow. Into these corners the shining hand floated, and its radiating light rendered the various objects that came within its influence perfectly distinct. Presently, it shone over something that made Mr. Greenwood stagger. That something was his own travelling box that had disappeared when Dewey went away. It was a box peculiar to commercial travellers, being almost square with a flush lid, the whole encased with leather, and secured with two brass bands, which were made to be fastened with small padlocks, in addition to the ordinary lock, which was unusually strong. The box was now split and broken. It had evidently been smashed open with a heavy hammer, or similar instrument. If Mr. Greenwood had really had any fear, it left him as he thus discovered a portion of his lost property, and the movement of the phantom hand had now an intelligent meaning for him. It had revealed to him his lost box, and that was a link. But what Mr. Greenwood thought was this. Hugh Dewey had leagued himself with the Chisholms, feeling perhaps that unless he shared the plunder with them he would not get away. The 3 keys, for there were 3, one for each padlock and one for the centre lock, were, on the night of the robbery, in Mr. Greenwood's possession, and no amount of ordinary force would have opened the box, which was made of stout oak. For one man to have carried it away would very severely have taxed his powers, and it was a consideration of this fact which had caused Mr. Greenwood to suspect that some of the Chisholms must have been party to the robbery. He had dwelt and dwelt upon that one idea until it had become a conviction with him that Dewey had had a confederate, and it was in the hope that he might be able to trace that confederate that he decided to revisit the bell. These thoughts passed rapidly through his mind as he stood contemplating the wreck of his travelling case, which certainly would have escaped the eye of a casual observer, for it was thrown amongst a heap of rubbish of all kinds, including broken packing cases. When the hand had thus made its revelation, it floated down through the trap-door, and Greenwood followed. When he reached the passage, there was the phantom hand stationary, with the index finger pointing towards the stairs that led to the lower story. Mr. Greenwood was a little puzzled at first to understand what this meant, and he stood irresolute until it struck him that he was to go downstairs. But he was in his night-clothes, so he returned to his room and hastily slipped on his trousers, coat, and boots, then went out into the passage once more. Sure enough, there was that marvelous sight still, the shining hand, spreading around it a light that made things faintly visible, and controlled, as was obvious, by some intelligent will. It was wonderful, thrilling, and startling, but Mr. Greenwood was too absorbed then to be startled. He felt that he was being made the instrument to bring criminals to justice and clear up what had so long been a mystery. Following the hand, he descended the stairs, and he was conscious of treading with the greatest care, so as to make no noise and thus avoid the risk of awakening anyone in the house. When the entrance door to the house was reached, the luminous hand, much to Mr. Greenwood's amazement, slipped the bars and bolts and opened the door with absolute silence, and then floated out into the open. And of course Greenwood followed, But now he was bewildered, for he could not comprehend why he was being taken outside. The moonlight was most brilliant, so that the lustre of the hand was lessened, but still it was perfectly visible, and it moved towards the moss. It is necessary to explain that this moss was an extensive tract of quagmire and bog, overgrown with bog cotton, rushes, and heather. There were beaten tracks through it, worn by the country people and fishermen as they passed to and from the sea. Streams also flowed through, creating in parts very dangerous places into which a person unacquainted with them might plunge, in which case he would most certainly have been lost forever. But Greenwood was not conscious of the slightest misgivings of fear. Though he knew nothing from actual experience of the moss, he knew that it bore an evil reputation and was exceedingly dangerous to strangers attempting to traverse its intricacies. But Greenwood was inspired with courage and confidence by the sight of that phantom hand, and whither it led, he followed. And he followed it down one of the beaten tracks until it reached the spot, so far as he could judge, where from his window he had seen what he then supposed was a will-o'-the-wisp. Now it hovered and flitted to and fro, just like a will-o'-the-wisp, though its radius was very limited. Mr. Greenwood would have been obtuse indeed if he had not speedily come to the conclusion that there was something buried there, but he could not dig, because he had no implements. So what he did was this. He took off a silk handkerchief he had round his neck, and with his knife he pegged it on that spot of ground, and almost at that instant the shining hand vanished. Mr. Greenwood went back to the house feeling somewhat dazed and bewildered. He found the door unfastened, and he had no difficulty in getting in. But when he reached his room, he was under the impression that he had certainly been dreaming, and to assure himself that he had not, he lit his candle and mounted to the loft again. And there, sure enough, he beheld the broken box. And now a terrible thought began to haunt him, a thought that worked him into a fever of excitement, and at last he crept downstairs, having fully attired himself. He got into the stables, and, saddling a horse, set off at full speed to Carlisle, where he lost no time in obtaining an interview with the mayor. He did not tell him, however, anything about the shining hand, fearing that he might be taken for a fool or a madman. But he stated that he had strong grounds for believing that the Chisholms had been guilty of a crime, and he requested that a warrant might be made out for their arrest, and that efficient and armed officers might be sent back with him to execute the warrant. On the strength of this definite statement, the warrant was duly prepared, and 6 men sent to the Bell. The first thing Greenwood did then was to get 2 of them to dig in the moss where he had pegged his handkerchief, and very soon the sickening fear that had been haunting him was realized, for the diggers came across the half-decomposed corpse of Hugh Dewey. At that gruesome sight Mr. Greenwood nearly fainted, and he wept like a child when he remembered how he had suspected poor Dewey of being the thief. The sequel is soon told. The Chisholms were all arrested on the charge of murder, and subsequently the youngest son made a clean breast of the affair, and he stated that he and his 2 brothers determined to murder Dewey and bury him in the swamp, as his disappearance would give rise to the suspicion that he had stolen the box. He was killed by being struck on the head with a hammer while asleep, and the box was carried out and smashed up, and the property equally shared. And before daylight came, the body had been disposed of, and the broken box hidden away in the lumber loft. The old people, although they had no hand in the crime, were cognizant of it, and received a share of the plunder. At the trial which ensued in due course, they were sentenced to transportation for life, while the 3 sons were condemned to death. The sentence on the youngest was subsequently commuted, but the others paid the penalty of their wrong. Mr. Greenwood never divulged by what means he discovered the crime, which was actually committed at the time and spot described, and was for long the talk of the countryside. Nobody could be found to take the bell, which gradually fell into ruins, and was at last razed to the ground as an accursed place. The remains of poor Dewey were conveyed to his native village at the expense of Mr. Greenwood's firm, and a marble monument was placed above his grave. Much curiosity was naturally evinced to know how Mr. Greenwood had unearthed the crime so long afterwards, but he made no attempt to satisfy the curiosity. He did, however, write a long and circumstantial account of the mysterious appearance of the Shining Hand. That paper was kept by his family with many others after his death, and it is from the particulars given in that musty old manuscript that this story has been compiled. A Night of Horror. My dear old chum, before you leave England for the East, I claim the redemption of a promise you made to me some time ago, that you would give me the pleasure of a week or two of your company. Besides, as you may have already guessed, I have given up the folly of my bachelor days, and have taken unto myself the sweetest woman that ever walked the face of the earth. We have been married just 6 months, and are as happy as the day is long. And then, this place is entirely after your own heart. It will excite all your artistic faculties, and appeal with irresistible force to your romantic nature. To call the building a castle is somewhat pretentious, but I believe it has been known as the castle ever since it was built, more than 200 years ago. Hester is delighted with it, and if either of us was in the least degree superstitious, we might see or hear ghosts every hour of the day. Of course, as becomes a castle, we have a haunted room, though my own impression is that it is haunted by nothing more fearsome than rats. Anyway, it is such a picturesque, curious sort of chamber that if it hasn't a ghost, it ought to have. But I have no doubt, old chap, that you will make one of us, for, as I remember, you have always had a love for the eerie and creepy, and you cannot forget how angry you used to get with me sometimes for chaffing you about your avowed belief in the occult and supernatural, and what you were pleased to term the inexplicable phenomena of psychomancy. However, it is possible you have got over some of the errors of your youth, but whether or not, calm down and rest assured that you will meet with the heartiest of welcomes. Your old pal, Dick Dirkman, Bleak Hill Castle. The above letter was from my old friend and college chum, who, having inherited a substantial fortune, and being passionately fond of the country and country pursuits, had thus the means of gratifying his tastes to their fullest bent. Although Dick and I were very differently constituted, we had always been greatly attached to each other. In the best sense of the term, he was what is generally called a hard-headed, practical man. He was fond of saying he never believed in anything he couldn't see, and even that which he could see he was not prepared to accept as truth without due investigation. In short, Dick was neither romantic, poetical, nor, I'm afraid, artistic in the literal sense. He preferred facts to fancies, and was possessed of what the world generally called an unimpressionable nature. For nearly 4 years I had lost sight of my friend, as I had been wandering about Europe as tutor and companion to a delicate young nobleman. His death had set me free, but I had no sooner returned to England than I was offered and accepted a lucrative appointment in India, and there was every probability of my being absent for a number of years. On returning home, I had written to Dick, telling him of my appointment, and expressing a fear that unless we could snatch a day or two in town, I might not be able to see him, as I had so many things to do. I had not heard of his marriage. His letter gave me the first intimation of that fact, and I confess that when I got his missive, I experienced some curiosity to know the kind of lady he had succeeded in captivating. I had always had an idea that Dick was cut out for a bachelor, for there was nothing of the ladies' man about him. And now Dick was actually married, and living in a remote region where most town-bred people would die of ennui. I did not hesitate about accepting Dick's cordial invitation. I determined to spare a few days at least of my somewhat limited time, and duly notified Dick to that effect, giving him the date of my departure from London and the hour at which I should arrive at the station nearest to his residence. Bleak Hill Castle was situated in one of the most picturesque parts of Wales. Consequently, on the day appointed, I found myself comfortably ensconced in a smoking carriage of a London and North Western train. And towards the close of the day, the time of the year was May, I was the sole passenger to alight at the wayside station, where Dick awaited me with a smart dog-cart. His greeting was hearty and robust, and when his man had packed in my traps, he gave the handsome little mare that drew the cart the reins, and we spanked along the country roads in rare style. A drive of 8 miles through the bracing Welsh air meant that it was dark when we arrived, and I had no opportunity of observing the external characteristics of Bleak Hill Castle. But there was nothing in the interior that suggested bleakness. It was warm, comfortable, and well lit. Following the maid up a broad flight of stairs and along a lofty and echoing corridor, I found myself in a large and comfortably furnished bedroom. A bright wood fire burned upon the hearthstone, for although it was May, the temperature was still very low on the Welsh hills. Hastily changing my clothes, I made my way to the dining room, where Mrs. Dirkman emphasized the welcome her husband had already given me. She was an exceedingly pretty and rather delicate-looking little woman, in striking contrast to her great, bluff, burly husband. A few neighbors had been gathered together to meet me, and we sat down, a dozen all told, to a perfect dinner. It was perhaps natural, when the coffee and cigar stage had arrived, that the conversation should turn upon our host's residence, by way of affording me, a stranger to the district, some information. Of course, the information was conveyed to me in a scrappy way, but I gathered in substance that Bleak Hill Castle had originally belonged to a Welsh family, chiefly distinguished by the extravagance and gambling propensities of its male members. It had gone through some exciting times, and numerous strange and startling stories were told of it. There were stories of wrong and shame and death, and more than a suggestion of dark crimes. One of these stories turned upon the mysterious disappearance of the wife and daughter of a young scion of the house, whose career had been somewhat shady. His wife was considerably older than he, and it was generally supposed that he had married her for money. His daughter, a girl of about 12, was an epileptic patient, while the husband and father was a gloomy, disappointed man. Suddenly, the wife and daughter disappeared. At first, no surprise was felt, but then some curiosity was expressed to know where they had gone to, and curiosity led to wonderment, and wonderment to rumor, for people will gossip, especially in a country district. Mr. Greta Jones, the husband, had to submit to much questioning as to where his wife and child were staying. But being sullen and morose of temperament, he contented himself by brusquely saying they had gone to London. But as no one had seen them go, and no one had heard of their going, the statement was accepted as a perversion of fact. Nevertheless, incredible as it may seem, no one thought it worthwhile to insist upon an investigation, and a few weeks later Mr. Greta Jones himself went away, and to London, as was placed beyond doubt. For a long time Bleak Hill Castle was shut up, and throughout the countryside it began to be whispered that sights and sounds had been seen and heard at the castle which were suggestive of things unnatural, and soon it became widely believed that the place was haunted. On the principle of giving a dog a bad name, you have only to couple ghosts with the name of an old country residence like this castle for it to fall into disfavour and to be generally shunned. As might have been expected in such a region, the castle was shunned. No tenant could be found for it. It was allowed to go to ruin, and for a long time was the haunt of smugglers. They were cleared out in the process of time, and at last hard-headed, practical Dick Dirkman heard of the place through a London agent, went down to see it, took a fancy to it, bought it for an old song, and soon converted the half-ruined building into a country gentleman's home, and thither he carried his bride. Such was the history of Bleak Hill Castle as I gathered it, in outline during the post-prandial chat on that memorable evening. On the following day, I found the place all that my host had described it in his letter to me. Its situation was beautiful in the extreme, and from its windows there was a magnificent view of landscape and sea. He and I rambled about the house. He evinced a keen delight in showing me every nook and corner, in expatiating on the beauties of the locality generally, and of the advantages of his dwelling place in particular. Why he reserved taking me to the so-called haunted chamber until the last I never have known, but so it was, and as he threw open the heavy door and ushered me into the apartment, he smiled ironically and remarked, "Well, old man, this is the ghost's den, and as I consider that a country mansion of this kind should have its haunted room, I have let this place go untouched. But I needn't tell you that I regard the ghost stories as rot." I did not reply to my friend at once, for the room absorbed my attention. It was unquestionably the largest of the bedrooms in the castle, and, while in keeping with the rest of the house, had characteristics of its own. The walls were panelled with dark oak. The floor was polished oak. There was a deep, V-shaped bay formed by an angle of the castle, and in each side of the bay was a diamond-paned window, and under each window an oak seat, which was also a chest with an ancient iron lock. A large wooden bedstead with massive hangings stood in one corner. The rest of the furniture was of a very nondescript character. In a word, the room was picturesque, and to me it at once suggested all sorts of dramatic situations of a weird and eerie character. There was a very large fireplace with a most capacious hearthstone, on which stood a pair of ponderous and rusty steel dogs. Finally, the window commanded superb views, and altogether my fancy was pleased, and my artistic susceptibilities appealed to in an irresistible manner, so that I replied to my friend thus, "I like this room, Dick. Let me occupy it, will you?" He laughed. "Well, upon my word, you're an eccentric fellow to want to give up the comfortable den which I've assigned to you for this mouldy, draughty, dingy old lumber room. However," here he shrugged his shoulders, "there is no accounting for tastes, so I'll tell the servants to put the bed in order, light a fire, and cart your traps from the other room." I was glad I had carried my point, for I frankly confess to having romantic tendencies. I was fond of old things, old stories and legends, old furniture, and anything that was removed above the dull level of commonplaceness. This room, in a certain sense, was unique, and I was charmed with it. When pretty little Mrs. Dirkman heard of the arrangements, she said, with a laugh that did not conceal a certain nervousness, "I am sorry you are going to sleep in that wretched room. It always makes me shudder, for it seems so uncomfortable. Besides, you know, although Dick laughs at me and calls me a little goose, I am inclined to believe there may be some foundation for the current stories. Anyway, I wouldn't sleep in the room for a crown of gold. I do hope you will be comfortable, and not be frightened to death by gruesome apparitions." I hastened to assure my hostess that I should be comfortable enough, while as for apparitions, I was not likely to be frightened by them. The rest of the day was spent in exploring the country round about, and after dinner Dick and I played billiards until 1 o'clock, and then, having drained a final peg, I retired to rest. When I reached the haunted chamber, I found that much had been done to give an air of cheerfulness and comfort to the place. Some rugs had been laid about the floor, a modern chair or two introduced, a wood fire blazed on the hearth. On a little occasional table that stood near the fire was a silver jug, filled with hot water, and an antique decanter containing spirits, together with lemon and sugar, in case I wanted a final brew. I could not but feel grateful for my host and hostess's thoughtfulness, and having donned my dressing gown and slippers, I drew a chair near the fire and proceeded to fill my pipe for a few whiffs, previous to tumbling into bed. This was a habit of mine that afforded me solace and conduced to restful sleep. So I lit my pipe and fell to pondering and trying to see if I could draw any suggestions as to my future from the glowing embers. Suddenly, a remarkable thing happened. My pipe was drawn gently from my lips and laid upon the table, and at the same moment I heard what seemed to me to be a sigh. For a moment or two I felt confused, and wondered whether I was awake or dreaming. But there was the pipe on the table, and I could have taken the most solemn oath that, to the best of my belief, it had been placed there by unseen hands. My feelings, as may be imagined, were peculiar. It was the first time in my life that I had ever been the subject of a phenomenon capable of being attributed to supernatural agency. After a little reflection, and some reasoning with myself, however, I tried to believe that my own senses had made a fool of me, and that in a half-somnolent and dreamy condition I had removed the pipe myself and placed it on the table. Having come to this conclusion, I divested myself of my clothing, extinguished the 2 tall candles, and jumped into bed. Although usually a good sleeper, I did not go to sleep at once, but lay thinking of many things. Mingling with my changing thoughts was a low, monotonous undertone, nature's symphony, of booming sea on the distant beach, and a bass piping, rising occasionally to a shrill and weird upper note of the wind. From its situation, the house was exposed to every wind that blew, hence its name, Bleak Hill Castle. The booming sea and wind had a lullaby effect, and I fell asleep. How long I slept I do not know, but I awoke suddenly and with a start, for it seemed as if a stream of ice-cold water was pouring over my face. With an impulse of indefinable alarm, I sprang up in bed, and then a strange, awful, ghastly sight met my view. The sight I gazed upon appalled me, yet was I fascinated with a horrible fascination that rendered it impossible for me to turn my eyes away. I seemed bound by some strange, weird spell. My limbs appeared to have grown rigid. There was a sense of burning in my eyes. My mouth was parched and dry, my tongue swollen, so it seemed. Of course, these were mere sensations, but they were sensations I never wished to experience again. They were sensations that tested my sanity, and the sight that held me in the thrall was truly calculated to test the nerves of the strongest. There, in mid-air, between floor and ceiling, surrounded by a trembling, nebulous light, weird beyond the power of any words to describe, was the head and bust of a woman. The face was paralyzed into an unutterably awful expression of stony horror. The long black hair was tangled and disheveled, and the eyes appeared to be bulging from the head. But this was not all. 2 ghostly hands were visible, The fingers of one were twined savagely in the black hair, and the other grasped a long-bladed knife, and with it hacked and gashed and tore and stabbed at the bare white throat of the woman, and the blood gushed forth from the jagged wounds, reddening the spectre hand and flowing in one continuous stream to the oak floor, where I heard it drip, 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 until my brain seemed as if it would burst, and I felt as if I was going mad. Then I saw with my strained eyes the unmistakable sign of death pass over the woman's face. And next, the devilish hands flung the mangled remnants away, and I heard a low chuckle of satisfaction. Heard, I say, and swear it as plainly as I have ever heard anything in this world. The light had faded. The vision of crime and death had gone, and yet the spell held me. Although the night was cold, I believe I was bathed in perspiration. I think I tried to cry out. Nay, I'm sure I did. But no sound came from my burning, parched lips. My tongue refused utterance. It clove to the roof of my mouth. Could I have moved so much as a joint of my little finger, I could have broken the spell. At least such was the idea that occupied my half-stunned brain. It was a nightmare of waking horror, and I shudder now as I recall it all. But the revelation, for revelation it was, had not yet reached its final stage. Out of the darkness was once more evolved a faint, phosphorescent glow, and in the midst of it appeared the dead body of a young girl with her throat all gashed and bleeding, the red blood flowing in a crimson flood over her nightrobe. And the cruel, spectral hands, dyed with her blood, appeared again, and grasped her, and lifted her, and bore her along. Then that vision faded, and a third appeared. This time I seemed to be looking into a gloomy, damp, arched cave or cellar, and the horror that froze me was intensified as I saw the hands busy preparing a hole in the wall at one end of the cave, and presently they lifted two bodies, the body of the woman and the body of the young girl, all gory and besmirched, and the hands crushed them into the hole in the wall, and then proceeded to brick them up. All these things I saw as I have described them, and this I solemnly swear to be the truth, as I hope for mercy at the supreme judgment. It was a vision of crime, a vision of merciless, pitiless, damnable murder. How long it all lasted, I don't know. Science has told us that dreams which seem to embrace a long series of years last but seconds, and in the few moments of consciousness that remain to the drowning man, his life scroll is unrolled before his eyes. This vision of mine, therefore, may only have lasted seconds, but it seemed to me hours, years, nay, an eternity. With that final stage in the ghostly drama of blood and death, the spell was broken, and flinging my arms wildly about, I know that I uttered a great cry as I sprang up in bed. Every detail of the horrific vision I recalled, and yet somehow it seemed to me that I had been the victim of a hideous nightmare. I felt ill, strangely ill. I was wet and clammy with perspiration, and nervous to a degree that I had never before experienced. Nevertheless, I noted everything distinctly. On the hearthstone there was still a mass of glowing red embers. I heard the distant booming of the sea, and round the house the wind moaned with a peculiar, eerie, creepy sound. Suddenly I sprang from the bed, impelled thereto by an impulse I was bound to obey, and by the same impulse I was drawn towards the door. I laid my hand on the handle. I turned it, opened the door, and gazed into the long, dark, corridor. A sigh fell upon my ears, an unmistakable human sigh, in which was expressed an intensity of suffering and sorrow that thrilled me to the heart. I shrank back, and was about to close the door, when out of the darkness appeared the glowing figure of a woman clad in blood-stained garments and with dishevelled hair. She turned her white, corpse-like face towards me, and her eyes pleaded with a pleading that was irresistible, while she pointed the index finger of her left hand downwards, and then beckoned me. Then I followed whither she led. I could no more resist than the unrestrained needle can resist the attracting magnet. Clad only in my night apparel, and with bare feet and legs, I followed the spectre along the corridor, down the broad oak stairs, traversing another passage to the rear of the building, until I found myself standing before a heavy, barred door. At that moment the spectre vanished, and I retraced my steps like one who walked in a dream. I got back to my bedroom, but how I don't quite know, nor have I any recollection of getting into bed. Hours afterwards I awoke. It was broad daylight. The horror of the night came back to me with overwhelming force, and made me faint and ill. I managed, however, to struggle through with my toilet, and hurried from that haunted room. It was a beautifully fine morning. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds carolled blithely in every tree and bush. I strolled out onto the lawn, and paced up and down. I was strangely agitated, and asked myself over and over again if what I had seen or dreamed about had any significance. Presently my host came out. He visibly started as he saw me. "Hello, old chap. What's the matter with you?" he exclaimed. "You look jolly queer, as though you had been having a bad night of it." "I have had a bad night." His manner became more serious and grave. "What? Seen anything?" "Yes." "The deuce? You don't mean it, really?" "Indeed I do. I have gone through a night of horror such as I could not live through again. But let us have breakfast first, and then I will try and make you understand what I have suffered, and you shall judge for yourself whether any significance is to be attached to my dream, or whatever you like to call it." We walked, without speaking, into the breakfast room, where my charming hostess greeted me cordially. But she, like her husband, noticed my changed appearance, and expressed alarm and anxiety. I reassured her by saying I had had a rather restless night, and didn't feel particularly well, but that it was a mere passing ailment. I was unable to partake of much breakfast, and both my good friend and his wife again showed some anxiety, and pressed me to state the cause of my distress. I recounted the experience I had gone through during the night of terror. So far from my host showing any disposition to ridicule me, as I quite expected he would have done, he became unusually thoughtful, and presently said, "Either this is a wild fantasy of your own brain, or there is something in it. The door that the ghost of the woman led you to is situated on the top of a flight of stone steps, leading to a vault below the building, which I have never used, and have never even had the curiosity to enter, though I did once go to the bottom of the steps. But the place was so exceedingly suggestive of a tomb that I shut it up, bolted and barred the door, and have never opened it since." I answered that the time had come when he must once more descend into that cellar or vault, whatever it was. He asked me if I would accompany him, and of course I said I would. So he summoned his head gardener, and after much searching about, the key of the door was found. But even then the door was only opened with difficulty, as lock and key alike were foul with rust. As we descended the slimy, slippery stone steps, each of us carrying a candle. A rank, mouldy smell greeted us, and a cold, noisome atmosphere pervaded the place. The steps led into a huge vault that apparently extended under the greater part of the building. The roof was arched and was supported by brick pillars. The floor was the natural earth and was soft and oozy. The miasma was almost overpowering, notwithstanding ventilating slits in the wall in various places. We proceeded to explore this vast cellar, and found that there was an air shaft which apparently communicated with the roof of the house, but it was choked with rubbish, old boxes and the like. The gardener cleared this away, and then, looking up, we could see the blue sky overhead. Continuing our exploration, we noted in a recess formed by the angle of the walls a quantity of bricks and mortar. Under other circumstances, this would not, perhaps, have aroused our curiosity or suspicions, but in this instance it did, and we examined the wall thereabouts with painful interest, until the conviction was forced upon us that a space of over a yard in width and extending from floor to roof had recently been filled in. I was drawn towards the new brickwork by some subtle magic, some weird fascination. I examined it with an eager, critical, curious interest, and the thoughts that passed through my brain were reflected in the faces of my companions. We looked at each other, and each knew by some unexplainable instinct what was passing in his fellow's mind. "It seems to me we are face to face with some mystery," remarked Dick solemnly. Indeed, throughout all the years I had known him, I had never before seen him so serious. Usually, his expression was that of good-humored cynicism, but now he might have been a judge about to pronounce the doom of death on a red-handed sinner. "Yes," I answered, "there is a mystery, unless I have been tricked by my own fancy." "It is strange," muttered Dick to himself. "Well, sir," chimed in the gardener, "you know there have been some precious queer stories going about for a long time, and before you come and took the place, plenty of folks round about used to say they'd seen some uncanny sights. I never had no faith in them stories myself, but after all, maybe there's truth in 'em." Dick picked up half a brick and began to tap the wall where the new work was, and the taps gave forth a hollow sound, quite different from the sound produced when the other parts of the wall were struck. "I say, old chap," exclaimed my host, with a sorry attempt at a smile, "upon my word, I begin to experience a sort of uncanny kind of feeling. I'll be hanged if I'm not getting as superstitious as you are." "You may call me superstitious if you like, but either I have seen what I have seen, or my senses have played the fool with me. Anyway, let us put it to the test." "How?" "By breaking away some of that new brickwork." Dick laughed a laugh that wasn't a laugh, as he asked, "What do you expect to find?" I hesitated to say, and he added the answer himself. "Mouldering bones, if your ghostly visitor hasn't deceived you." "Mouldering bones," I echoed involuntarily. "Gardener, have you got a crowbar amongst your tools?" Dick asked. "Yes, sir." "Go up and get it." The man obeyed the command. "This is a strange sort of business altogether," Dick continued, after glancing round the vast and gloomy cellar. "But, upon my word, to tell you the truth, I'm half ashamed of myself for yielding to anything like superstition. It strikes me that you'll find you're the victim of a trick of the imagination, and that these bogey fancies of yours have placed us in rather a ridiculous position." In answer to this, I could not possibly resist reminding Dick that even scientists admitted that there were certain phenomena that could not be accounted for by ordinary laws. Dick shrugged his shoulders and remarked with assumed indifference, Perhaps it is so." He proceeded to fill his pipe with tobacco, and having lit it, he smoked with a nervous energy quite unusual with him. The gardener was only away about 10 minutes, but it seemed infinitely longer. He brought both a pickaxe and a crowbar with him, and in obedience to his master's orders, he commenced to hack at the wall. A brick was soon dislodged. Then the crowbar was inserted in the hole, and a mass prized out. From the opening came forth a sickening odor, so that we all drew back instinctively, and I am sure we all shuddered. I saw the pipe fall from Dick's lips, but he snatched it up quickly and puffed at it vigorously until a cloud of smoke hung in the fetid and stagnant air. Then, picking up a candle from the ground where it had been placed, he approached the hole, holding the candle in such a position that its rays were thrown into the opening. In a few moments, he started back with an exclamation. "My God! The ghost hasn't lied," he said, and I noticed that his face was sheet white. I peered into the hole, and so did the gardener, and we both drew back with a start, for there in the recess were decayed human remains. "This awful business must be investigated," said Dick. "Come, let us go." We needed no second bidding. We were only too glad to quit that place of horror and get into the fresh air and bright sunlight. We verily felt that we had come up out of a tomb. Half an hour later, Dick and I were driving to the nearest town to lay information of the awful discovery we had made. The subsequent search carried out by the police brought 2 bodies to light. Critical medical examination left not the shadow of a doubt that they were the remains of a woman and a girl, and each had been brutally murdered. Of course, it became necessary to hold an inquest, and the police set to work to collect evidence as to the identity of the bodies hidden in the recess in the wall. Naturally, all the stories which had been current for so many years throughout the country were revived. The chief topic was that of the strange disappearance of the wife and daughter of the last owner of the castle, Greta Jones. This story had been touched upon the previous night during the after-dinner chat in my host's smoking room. Jones, as was remembered, had gambled his fortune away and married a lady much older than himself, who bore him a daughter who was subject to epileptic fits. When this girl was about 12, she and her mother disappeared from the neighborhood, and, according to the husband's account, they had gone to London. Then he left, and people troubled themselves no more about him and his belongings. A quarter of a century had passed since that period, and Bleak Hill Castle had gone through many vicissitudes until it fell into the hands of Dick Dirkman. The more the history of Greta Jones was gone into, the more it was clear that the remains which had been bricked up in the cellar were those of his wife and daughter. That the unfortunate girl and woman had been brutally and barbarously murdered was beyond doubt. The question was, who murdered them? After leaving Wales, Greta Jones, as was brought to light, led a wild life in London. One night, while in a state of intoxication, he was knocked down by a cab, and so seriously injured that he died while being carried to the hospital, and with him his secret, for could there be any reasonable doubt that, even if he was not the actual murderer, he had connived at the crime? But there was reason to believe that he had killed his wife and child with his own hand, and that with the aid of a navvy whose services he bought, he bricked the bodies up in the cellar. It was remembered that a navvy named Howell Williams had been in the habit of going to the castle frequently, and that suddenly he became possessed of what was, for him, a considerable sum of money. For several weeks he drank hard. Then, being a single man, he packed up his few belongings and gave out that he was going to California and all efforts to trace him failed. So much for this ghastly crime. As to the circumstances that led to its discovery, it was curious that I should have been selected as the medium for bringing it to light. Why it should have been so, I cannot and do not pretend to explain. I have recorded facts as they occurred. I leave others to solve the mystery. It was not a matter for surprise that Mrs. Dirkman should have been deeply affected by the terrible discovery, and she declared to her husband that if she were to remain at the castle, she would either go mad or die. And so poor Dick, who was devoted to his charming little wife, got out as soon as he could, and once more Bleak Hill Castle fell into neglect and ultimate ruin, until at last it was razed to the ground, and modern buildings reared on its site. As for myself, that night of horror I endured under Dick's roof affected me to such an extent that my hair became prematurely grey, and even now, when I think of the agony I endured, I shudder with an indefinable sense of fear. The blood drips. For a long time, for years in fact, at short intervals, the following advertisement appeared in most, if not all, the London papers, and many of the provincial ones. To let, on long lease at low rental, or freehold to be sold cheap, a magnificent family residence, complete with every convenience, suitable for a large family. The house stands in its own grounds, comprising nearly 3.5 acres, part of which is natural wood, while the remainder is laid out as flower and kitchen gardens. There is stabling for 4 or 5 horses, with commodious carriage house, harness room, hay and corn lofts, and spacious apartments for coachmen, grooms, etc. The property, which is only 25 miles from London, enjoys an unequalled situation, both as regards salubrity and views. The country is open all round, with extensive woods in the neighbourhood. The climate is bracing, gravel soil lying on chalk, an adequate supply of water, and drainage perfect. Apply in the first instance to Smeaton, Weardale and Smeaton, estate and house agents, valuers and auctioneers, etc. 105 New Bond Street, London, West. On the first blush, this advertisement was very attractive, and its bona fides was beyond question, seeing that such a well-known and old-established firm as Smeaton, Weardale and Smeaton was responsible for it. But a second reading would naturally have caused any thinking person to ask himself why, if this property was all that was represented, it should be offered at a very low rental, or cheaply if bought. Now, it was very certain that there was something wrong. Otherwise, a magnificent family residence and 3.5 acres of ground need not wait long for a customer. But, as already stated, this advertisement continued to appear at short intervals for years, so that those who were familiar with it knew quite well that out of the hundreds of thousands of people who must have read it, no one had yet been induced to invest. Now, what was the object in continuing the advertisement, upon which a large sum of money must have been spent, if a customer was not forthcoming? The only answer to this was that the owner or owners of the property hoped that by continuing it long enough, the advertisement would at last attract the right person. And in the end, this hope was realized. One morning, an August morning it was, brilliant with sunlight, when even grimy London looked bright and cheerful, a gentleman entered the office of Smeaton, Weardale and Smeaton. There was something about him that suggested longer residence abroad, his dress and appearance generally. He wore a soft grey felt hat, a large flowing necktie and loose collar, and a grey check suit of clothes which, though faultless as to their cut, had never been made in England, or at any rate not in London. For your London tailor has a style which, to the practised eye, is unmistakable. The gentleman was evidently an invalid or a convalescent. He was thin, languid, and delicate-looking. There were dark rims under his eyes, and though his face was tanned with sun, it was greyish in its hue, and suggestive of an undermined constitution. Smeaton, Weardale, and Smeaton's offices were extensive and luxuriously fitted, as became a first-class firm of estate agents in so fashionable a neighbourhood as New Bond Street. The gentleman was received by a page boy, and shown into a waiting-room, which was furnished with velvet lounges and chairs, and plentifully supplied with newspapers. "I wish to see one of the principals," said the gentleman, handing the page boy his card, on which was engraved, "Walter Reginald Minton, M.E., British Columbia." The boy bowed, took the card, and retired. In a few minutes, an obsequious clerk entered, and with many bows requested Mr. Walter Reginald Minton to kindly step this way, sir. Mr. Minton followed the clerk, who showed him into a large, handsomely furnished room, the walls of which were covered with photographs of houses of all kinds and coloured plans of estates. At a massive mahogany desk sat a well-preserved gentleman long past the prime of life, but with silver hair, a bright, keen eye, and a rubicund face that suggested a fondness for good living and old crusted port. "Do I address Mr. Smeaton?" asked the stranger. "Yes, sir. I am the head of the firm. Pray take a chair." And Mr. Smeaton put his white, fat hands together with professional dignity, and waited for his visitor to state his business. "I've noticed an advertisement in the Times," began Mr. Minton, taking from his pocket-book a half-sheet of note-paper, on which the advertisement alluded to had been neatly gummed. "It has reference to the sale of a family residence, and I should like to have some further particulars about it." Mr. Smeaton's eyes brightened up with joyful expectancy, as, glancing at the sheet of note-paper, he recognized the advertisement which had become fossilized, so to speak, in the London dailies. "Oh, yes," he answered pleasantly, and with a most becoming smile. "The advertisement accurately describes the property. Where is it situated?" "An hour's run from London." "There will be no difficulty in my seeing it?" "Oh, none whatever. I may mention that I am a mining engineer, and have been for many years in British Columbia. But, having made a moderate fortune, and being in very bad health, I am anxious to settle down in my native country." "Ah, just so," remarked Mr. Smeaton blandly, and stroking his smoothly shaven chin. "Are you a family man, Mr. Minton, may I ask?" "Yes. I have a wife and one daughter, 20 years of age." Mr. Smeaton's countenance seemed to fall just ever so little as he replied, "I am afraid, then, if your family is so small, you may find the house larger than you require." "Oh, no," answered Minton quickly, and Mr. Smeaton's countenance recovered again. "We like a large house, for we keep a good deal of company." "Then I don't think you can do better than purchase Dumthorpe Hall," said Mr. Smeaton, with a gracious smile. "Is that the name of the place?" "Yes. Of course, if you become the owner, you will be at liberty to adopt any other name you like. Now, I suggest, before entering into any further particulars, that we go down and see the property. You couldn't have a better day. The country will be charming under this brilliant sun. If you will allow me, I shall have much pleasure in accompanying you." "That will suit me admirably. I'm staying at the Tavistock Hotel. We can call there in a cab and pick up my wife and daughter." Mr. Smeaton struck his bell, and the page boy appeared with such alacrity that one might have thought that the bell set some spring in motion which shot the boy into the room. "Peter, look up the next train." "Yes, sir." 2 minutes later, the boy came back. "There is a train at 12:50, sir." "Good." Mr. Smeaton looked at his massive gold watch, although a handsome clock stood on the mantelpiece, the force of habit, no doubt. "We have an hour and a half, ample time, and as I have a little business to do, perhaps you will permit me to meet you at the station." "Oh, certainly." A few minutes later, Mr. Minton was on his way to his hotel, and, punctual to the time, he and his wife, a charming but delicate and nervous-looking lady, and his daughter, a no less charming girl, were at the station, where Mr. Smeaton had already arrived and procured first-class tickets. On alighting, after an hour's run through a pleasant country, a brougham and pair of horses, which Mr. Smeaton had ordered by telegraph from the landlord of the hotel near the station, were waiting, and the party at once drove to Dumthorpe Hall, a distance of over 6 miles from the station. "I should mention," remarked Mr. Smeaton, just before reaching the place, "that the property has unfortunately been allowed to fall into a somewhat dilapidated condition, for the owner, who is in India, has sadly neglected it. However, that will be duly taken into consideration in fixing the purchase money." As regards the situation, the advertisement had scarcely done it justice. The country, diversified with wood, hill, and dale, was charming, and looked at its very best on this brilliant summer's day. The entrance to the grounds of Dumthorpe Hall was through a gateway, the gates being wrought iron and of a handsome design, but now rusty and out of the perpendicular, owing to the sinking of one of the foundations of one of the pillars on which they were hung. Some difficulty, therefore, was experienced in getting in. There was a small lodge at the entrance, but it was overrun with ragged creepers, and the windows were covered with the accumulated dirt of years. As the visitors stood for a few moments looking about them, after the difficulty of opening the gate had been overcome, Miss Minton suddenly uttered a startled cry, and clung in alarm to her father's arm. "What is it? What is it, my dear?" he asked quickly. "Oh, look there!" she exclaimed, pointing with her parasol to the ground a few feet away. And he did look, and beheld an adder leisurely moving across the pathway. Mr. Smeaton saw it too, and, springing forward, he struck the reptile with his stick, killing it at once, and he tossed it among the trees out of sight. "If I were superstitious," remarked Mr. Minton, "I should take that as an evil omen." "I am glad you are not superstitious," replied Mr. Smeaton with a laugh, "for the fact is, this place has the reputation of being haunted." He uttered this quickly, jerked it out, as it were, as though he was glad to get it off his mind, the incident of the snake having given him the opportunity of making the remark. "Haunted!" exclaimed the two ladies in a breath, while something like a scared appearance came into their faces. "Of course that won't affect you, ladies," said Mr. Smeaton with his bland smile. "You're above being affected by such silly nonsense, I am sure." They walked on. The brougham followed slowly. The drive was all overgrown with moss and grass, and strewn with decaying leaves and pieces of branches of trees that had been whirled off by gales. Presently the drive took a turn, then expanded, and the house came in view. It was an old Elizabethan mansion, with pointed gables and a red-tiled roof that gave it a very quaint appearance, but it looked forlorn and mouldering to decay, even with the sun pouring down a flood of golden light upon it. Had it been seen under less favourable atmospheric conditions, It would certainly have worn a repellent aspect. Ivy and honeysuckle had struggled to the very eaves, and hung in straggling and ragged festoons about the windows. The interior of the hall was worse than the exterior. Cobwebs hung from the ceilings in long ropes. The paper had peeled from the walls. The fire grates were red with rust, the windows obscured with dirt, the floors black, and in some places rotten, while pervading the whole house was a dank, earthy, mouldering smell, like that which comes from a newly opened tomb. The ladies shuddered, and were evidently repelled by the cheerlessness and gloom of the house. But Mr. Smeaton chatted pleasantly and glibly. He had a smooth tongue and great fluency, and knew how to say pretty things in dulcet tones. He was very anxious to get the property off his hands, and as Mr. Minton seemed a likely customer, he was not going to let him slip if talking would secure him. The premises were thoroughly examined. They certainly were commodious and not ill-planned, but paint, paper, and whitewash everywhere wanted renewing. The same neglect characterized the grounds. They were howling wildernesses of ill weeds, and the conservatories were falling to pieces. The ladies certainly were not impressed, although they expressed admiration for the position and view, and there could be no doubt that the situation was healthy, for it stood high. Gravel and chalk were the geological features for miles round, and the air was singularly pure, while the water was liquid crystal. "Well," said Mr. Minton, reflecting when the survey was over, "I can see certain potentialities in that place." "Potentialities? I should think so, my dear sir," exclaimed the agent joyfully. "With the expenditure of a little money it can be made into a palace." Without answering this remark, Mr. Minton, turning to his wife and daughter, said, "What is your opinion, darlings?" "Well," answered his wife cautiously, "we have seen it under every possible disadvantage as far as neglect and dirt go, and I think it would want a lot of money spending to put it in order." "But what is the story about its being haunted?" asked the young lady, addressing Mr. Smeaton, and unable to suppress a little shudder. Mr. Smeaton laughed loudly, almost boisterously, as he made reply. "My dear young lady, such stories as these are always so ridiculous that they cannot be discussed by sensible people." He dismissed the subject with his bland smile and a lofty wave of his white hand. As they returned to town, Mr. Minton for the first time asked the price, and the figure named by Mr. Smeaton was so low that the other opened his eyes in astonishment. "Is there anything the matter with the place?" Mr. Minton asked with great point. "Nothing. I pledge you my honor," answered the agent, equally emphatic. "Beyond its reputation as a haunted house, but it is right to say that that reputation has kept the place untenanted for 20 years, with one short break. It was let on a yearly tenancy to a family who only remained, however, 6 months." "Why did they leave?" asked the two ladies in concert. "Well, they said that they heard noises, and that what looked like blood dripped from the ceilings." "Oh," exclaimed the mother and daughter with a little start, and nestling closer to each other, as if for mutual protection. Mr. Minton smiled skeptically, and this smile did not escape the agent, who said quickly, "I have told you frankly the cause of our not being able to let or sell the place. That is the sole reason. And it certainly does not say much for our boasted enlightenment that so splendid a property should go begging through such a senseless cause." "You are right, you are right," exclaimed Mr. Minton, and the other felt from this that the customer was secured. The following day, Mr. Minton, not wholly with his wife's and daughter's approbation, instructed his lawyers to make further inquiries and examine the title deeds. The inquiries elicited nothing beyond what the agent had stated, namely that people said it was haunted, while as for the title deeds, they were beyond dispute or quibble. The price asked was very low, but Mr. Minton's lawyers offered a still lower price, and as the agent's instructions were to sell at any price rather than let the place fall into absolute ruin, the bargain was closed, and Mr. Minton became the absolute possessor of Dumthorpe Hall. He immediately set a little army of workmen to work, gardeners, painters, paper-hangers, plumbers, etc., as he was anxious to move in before the winter. Very soon the place had been transformed, and the prejudice of the ladies gave way. As they saw the change, they expressed themselves delighted. As soon as the workmen were out, the upholsterers entered, and as they had carte blanche to furnish the house thoroughly and well, they had soon diffused comfort, warmth, and beauty, where erstwhile all was decay and mildew. It was the last week of October when the family moved in. The autumn tints were on the land, but beyond that there was no trace of the approaching winter. The days were still warm and bright and sunny, for it had been an exceptionally fine season. A number of servants were already installed. The greenhouses and conservatories were filled with flowers. The gardens were already bright and gay, while in the stables were horses and carriages. In fact, the place was complete with everything that could give comfort or enjoyment to the family. Mr. Minton was a liberal provider, and being wealthy, having made his pile out of mines in British Columbia, he spared no expense. For the first few weeks all went merry as a marriage bell. The ladies expressed themselves charmed with the place. The dark days of November were drawing to a close, and the house was full of visitors, when one morning the cook approached Mrs. Minton and said, "Can I speak to you, mum, for a few minutes?" "Certainly, cook. What is it?" "Well, mum," she began sheepishly, "I've been awfully annoyed for several nights by somebody walking about over my head." "Oh, nonsense, cook. That couldn't be. The room over you is a lumber room, and it's just filled up with boxes." "Yes, mum, I know that. And that's what makes the noise all the queerer. And then yesterday morning, something came down from the ceiling in the kitchen like blood." Mrs. Minton turned a little pale and shuddered, for she remembered that the agent had mentioned the story about blood dripping from the ceiling. "What an extraordinary thing," she said, with a forced laugh. "But the next time you're troubled with these phenomena, cook, pray come and call me." The cook did not seem quite satisfied as she went away, and that night, about 10 o'clock, she went to her mistress again with a scared white face, and said, "It's there again, mum. Will you please come to my room?" Mrs. Minton went, and to her surprise she heard a steady, measured tramp, tramp, tramp overhead. She sent for her husband. He came, and he heard the same sounds. He went into the room above, but there was nothing to account for those footsteps. In fact, so full was the room of boxes, trunks, etc., that there was not a clear floor space of 2 yards. Mrs. Minton did not go into the upper room. She waited for her husband coming down, and suddenly, as she was looking up towards the ceiling, something wet fell on her face. She uttered a little startled cry, and, taking out her handkerchief, wiped the wet off, and what was her astonishment to find that the handkerchief was stained with blood, or what seemed like blood. Such a shock did this cause her that she almost fainted, and when her husband returned, she was pale and trembling. He expressed himself mystified, and it was evident that he was very much impressed. It was agreed that nothing should be said about this to anyone in the house, and the cook was enjoined to keep the matter secret for the present. But the following morning after breakfast, the gentleman retired to the smoking-room for a few whiffs, when a young fellow named Dobell called out as he filled his pipe, "I say, Minton, old fellow, who is lodging over me?" "I don't think anyone is over you. In fact, I am sure there is not." "Why?" "Well, I don't know, but it seemed to me that some fellow with heavy boots did nothing but tramp about all night." Mr. Minton started. He could not help it, and he who had indignantly disavowed any belief in the supernatural was becoming superstitious. He laughed the matter off, however, and told his friend that he must have been suffering from nightmare. For the next 2 or 3 days, nothing else occurred, or at any rate was mentioned, until Miss Minton went into her mother's room in a state of great fright, and exclaimed, "Oh, Mamma, I've had such a shock! As I was dressing, something fell from the ceiling onto my face and neck, and when I wiped it off it was like blood." Mrs. Minton grew deadly pale as she heard this, but, recovering herself quickly, she answered, "Well, darling, I have experienced the same thing, but it is better to say nothing about it. As long as it is not more serious, we must put up with it. When the guests have gone, we will have the house examined. Possibly some trick is being played." Although she thus dismissed the subject for the time being, she could not get rid of the mystery so easily, and that strange drip from the ceilings was impartial, for it dripped on all alike, and in all parts of the house. Other ladies and gentlemen complained of it, and the ladies became alarmed, while a thorough investigation organized by the gentlemen was entirely barren of result. They could discover nothing, absolutely nothing, and the ceilings, which had all been newly whitened, were stainless. These people felt they were in the presence of some mystery which they could not solve. But what was it? Of course, the gentlemen scoffed, and even some of the stronger-minded ladies pooh-poohed. But there were others who held their peace, and as soon as they could courteously do so, they took their departure. Mr. Minton was greatly concerned. If this sort of thing was to continue, he would hardly get guests to stay with him, while as for his wife and daughter, it was evident they were suffering in their nerves. Then a fresh trouble arose. Some of the servants gave notice to leave, saying they were afraid to stay in such a place. The cook, who was an exceedingly good servant and liked her place, was loath to go, but she said that she would certainly have to leave if the annoyances did not stop. It need scarcely be said that the matter preyed upon Mr. Minton's mind. He had spent a large sum of money upon the house, and to be the victim of such an unsolvable annoyance was a great hardship. As Christmas approached, things seemed to get worse. Those drips from the ceilings were constantly falling, and the tramping, which was confined to 2 rooms, still went on. It became very obvious to Mr. Minton that his wife and daughter were suffering in health, though they tried not to show it, and he became greatly concerned. A new set of guests came down for Christmas, and care was taken not to put anyone into the room below that where the tramping was heard. But people complained, nevertheless, of red moisture dripping on them from the ceilings, and nervous people became frightened. Mr. Minton was not a man to be easily subdued. As a mining engineer, he had faced dangers in all shapes and forms, and had overcome difficulties that would have daunted less determined and less strong-minded men. But now this constant interruption to his domestic comfort and peace was telling sorely upon his already shattered health. He had come here for quietude and rest, but in spite of his care and lavish expenditure, it seemed as if his hopes were doomed to be blighted. As he was not quite able to divest himself of the idea that he was the victim of some stupid trickery, he, with the aid of a builder from the neighbouring town, examined the house from roof to basement, and all the time that he was pursuing his investigation, that mysterious dripping of a fluid like blood continued from the ceilings, and the tramping in the lumber room never ceased at night time. The examination, therefore, resulted in nothing, and the mystery was a mystery still. At last, driven to desperation, Mr. Minton resolved to try another expedient. That was to clear out the lumber room, have a bed put up there, and sleep in the room himself. This he did, against the earnest, prayerful entreaties of his wife and daughter, and even of the servants. But he was resolute, saying he had never feared living man, and nothing dead could harm him. The arrangements completed, he wished his wife and daughter a fond good night, and when they exacted a promise from him that he would violently ring his bell if he required assistance, he laughed heartily, and retired to what had now come to be called in the house the haunted room. His wife and daughter were restless and uneasy, but as the hours sped and there was no sound of the bell, they dropped off to sleep. In the morning, about 9 o'clock, Mr. Minton's valet went up to the room with hot water. He knocked at the door. There was no response. He knocked again, still no answer. So he tried the handle. It yielded, and he entered. Then from his hand fell the hot water jug he was carrying, and he staggered back with a wild cry of alarm. For lying on the bed, his limbs all contorted, the sheets twisted about his body like ropes, as if he had rolled and writhed in some torturing agony, his eyes starting from his head in horror, his mouth wide open, his hands clenched, the nails digging into the palms, was Mr. Minton, stone dead. Medical men were hastily summoned, but their services were of no avail. They could only certify that Mr. Minton, being in very delicate health, had received a shock of some sort, which had caused death. A shock of some sort. That was only too painfully evident. It did not need a medical man to state that. What they could not state was how the shock had been produced. Poor Mrs. Minton and her daughter were carried prostrated from the fatal house to a neighbour's, and they only entered it once again to take a last look at the remains of the husband and father. When he had been borne to his final resting place, his widow instructed her lawyers to sell off all the furniture immediately. That done, the accursed house was shut up, and it remained shut for over 12 years. No one could be found to take it, and at last, only a few years ago, the estate was sold, the house razed to the ground, and some small villas erected on the land, and Dumthorpe Hall became only a memory. Many people will no doubt remember what a fierce controversy raged at the time of Mr. Minton's tragic death, and how nearly every paper in the kingdom, big and little, advanced some theory to try and account for the phenomena which had alarmed servants and guests alike. Some of the papers discussed the affair banteringly, some with glib platitudes about the pitiable superstition which still lingered in some of the remote country districts. Others, again, half seriously, and others still with appalling learnedness. Divines and laymen alike entered into the conflict of opinions, but in the end nothing was proved, nothing was solved, and the extraordinary mystery remains a mystery still. The Spectre of Rislip Abbey. The particulars of this story have been supplied by a well-known member of Parliament from his own experience. The story is told almost in his own words. He is the owner of a broad and fair estate in central England, and has gained an enviable reputation for his high intelligence, his administrative ability, which on more than one occasion has been of great advantage to his party, as well as for his princely hospitality. Up to about 20 years ago, I was a comparatively poor man, and had to supplement my income by literary work which, being of a scientific character, had not a very wide market. However, at that time I succeeded to a snug patrimony, which freed my mind at once from all anxiety about the future. I had been married for 17 years, and had 2 daughters, Cynthia and Phyllis, aged 13 and 15 respectively. My wife was an invalid, and our medical attendant had frequently told me that her restoration to health depended to a large extent on her living in the country, and indulging in country pursuits. But want of adequate means had prevented our giving effect to this advice, for circumstances rendered it important that I should reside in London, and my wife resolutely refused to leave me. Consequently, we had been living in a modest flat, and made the best we could of its inconveniences and drawbacks. It was not surprising, therefore, that one of my first cares as soon as I was in possession of my fortune was to seek for some suitable country residence. We were all fond of the country, and my tastes inclined to the life of a gentleman farmer. I therefore called one morning on my friend, the late Mr. George R. Blank, the well-known West End auctioneer and estate agent. He had a connection all over Great Britain, and I knew that if anyone could find me the place I wanted, he could. After we had chatted for some time, and I had made known my requirements, he began to discuss the pros and cons of several estates he had on his books, but against all there was some objection to urge as far as I was concerned, until at last he exclaimed with a chuckle, "By Jove, I have it! Rislip Abbey, that's the place for you." Then, calling his head clerk, he desired him to bring the printed particulars of Rislip, which were read out as follows. Rislip, containing about 3,000 acres arable land, 500 acres pasture, 1,000 timber, mostly oak and beech, the rest park and ornamental grounds. The house is a quaint, old-fashioned, turreted mansion, believed to have been built about the end of the reign of Henry VIII. The place is without any historical interest. Most of the land lies well. The house stands high, and commands splendid views, but is in a dilapidated condition, not having had a tenant for the last 30 years. The property has been the subject of litigation, but the rightful ownership has now been determined. The foregoing were the crude particulars, so to speak, in outline, and having listened to them, I questioned my friend further, and asked him if he had personally surveyed the property. "I have," he answered. "And what is your opinion about it?" "Well, at present it is a wilderness, and the house is well nigh a ruin. Chancery, as you know, is like a blight and a curse. It ruins every property it has anything to do with, as well as breaks the hearts of men and women. Of course, the lawyers have done well while Rislip has been going to decay, and now the owners are too poor to spend any money on it, nor can they sell any portion of it for the next 25 years. But they would grant you a lease for that period, for a merely nominal rent, and give you the option of purchase. It would want a good deal of money laid out on it in the first instance, but my opinion is you could soon bring the land under cultivation and make it profitable. Anyway, go down and see the property. I'll go with you if you like. You will soon see if it is likely to suit you, and, of course, you can get the ghost and all thrown in." "Ghost?" I exclaimed with a laugh. "Oh, yes. I understand there is a real, genuine ghost, according to local tradition. The yokels swear that the place is haunted, but I should say the only spirits you will find there are bats and owls." I laughed at the ghost idea. I was pleased to think myself a hard-headed man, and my disposition was to view most things from a severely critical and scientific point of view. While as for spiritualism, I had nothing but contempt for those who professed to believe in it. Now, the result of my interview with my friend the auctioneer was that a week later we journeyed down to Rislip together, and spent 3 or 4 days in examining the estate. It was certainly not an exaggeration to call it a wilderness, while the house itself was crumbling to decay, but I saw at once the potentialities of the place, and as the situation of the house would have been hard to beat, while the rental asked was little more than nominal, I secured the refusal of the property for a fortnight. During that time I consulted my lawyers, took my wife and daughter down to Rislip, and as they confessed themselves charmed, and I found I could secure it almost on my own terms, I lost no time in closing, and at once proceeded to get estimates for putting the house in habitable condition. As may be imagined, I was very busy for the next 3 months, and by means of a liberal expenditure and ample labour, a very different aspect was imparted to the erstwhile wilderness, and the house was ready for occupation by the early part of November. Though the prospect of moving at such a period wasn't very pleasant, we faced it boldly, and by the end of the month were comfortably installed in our new quarters. In carrying out the repairs and alterations in the house, I had been careful not to interfere in any way with its structural arrangements, as its quaintness and rambling character appealed very forcibly to my antiquarian instincts. One of the features of the house was most certainly the dining room. It was a room of really noble proportions, unusually lofty for a building of that date, with 3 straight windows on one side, and at one end a very deep bay, from which there was a view second to none in the country. The floor, which had been laid with oak, was as level as a billiard table, and in a perfect state of preservation. The walls were all wainscoted from floor to ceiling, and as some of this had decayed, it had been found necessary to restore it during the process of renovating the house. In the course of this work, the men discovered a sliding door so artfully let in as a panel that anyone unacquainted with its existence would never have found it out. Behind the sliding panel was a narrow passage, leading to a flight of stone steps that descended to a second passage, closed by a door. This door gave access to a short tunnel that had its exit in the grounds, near a lake of considerable dimensions. Romantic, no doubt, as all this may seem, there was really nothing very remarkable in it, as very few country houses were built in Henry VIII's time, and indeed for long after his reign without a secret passage, the object being to afford the occupants a means of escape in case of need. The contractor who carried out the work for me suggested that the passage should be blocked up. To this I would not give my consent, but insisted on its being left in its original state, and in this decision I was supported by my wife and daughters. I ought to add that, running parallel with the dining room, and communicating by a doorway, was another room of smaller dimensions, but so conveniently situated and well lighted that I at once appropriated it as a library, as I had a valuable collection of books. By the middle of December we had quite settled down, and all felt charmed with our new home. Then we began to send out invitations very freely to our friends and relatives for Christmas, as we were desirous of having a good housewarming. Of course, during the short time I had been in possession, I had heard much gossip and gathered a good many interesting anecdotes about the property. The fact of its having at last changed hands aroused a great deal of interest and curiosity over a very extended area, for the history of Rislip was pretty well known, and the story of the Chancery suit and the ruin it had brought about had caused general regret, as it was regarded as a shame that so good a property should be allowed to run to waste. I found that there was a very curious belief that Rislip had its familiar spirit, in other words, that it was haunted. I tried to find out the foundation for this belief, but, as is usually the case, I was met with the reply, "Oh, I've never seen anything myself, but I've heard of people who have." When I tried to find out these people who, by common account had had ocular demonstration of the existence of disturbed spirits, I need scarcely say I failed. It is always so. Neither my wife nor I attached the slightest serious importance to the current stories. We were amused by them, and possibly there was just a tendency on our part to regard people who expressed belief in the supernatural as being far from what is generally termed strong-minded, to use a mild term. But now, to come to the strangest part of my narrative. I had been dining one night with my family, and we had had a neighbouring gentleman and his wife as guests. They had departed, and my wife and the girls had retired. I had remained to indulge in a final cigar, and enjoy the comfort of the brightly burning fire and the warm room. Outside, the weather was murky, cold, and dismal. My butler had been to inquire if I wished for anything more, and my wants having been attended to, he bade me good night and went to his room. After that I fell into a reverie. Possibly I may have dozed. Anyway, I was aroused to a sense of things mundane by a cold draught of air blowing upon me, and glancing round I saw, to my amazement, that the secret door or panel in the wall to which I have already alluded was wide open. Then I was still further amazed, I might almost say dumfounded, by seeing a hand, only a hand, slowly draw the panel into its place again. It is almost impossible for me to describe the extraordinary sensation that crept over me. There was something so uncanny in the whole proceeding. Now, I have already said I was not a superstitious man, and I think I may also assert that I was by no means lacking in courage. Nevertheless, for the moment I was the prey to a feeling of absolute funk. Then suddenly I thought that a trick was being tried upon me, and anger got the better of my funk. I seized the poker from the fireplace, rushed to the panel, got it open with some little difficulty, and peered into the darkness, but saw nothing, listened intently, but heard nothing. Next I snatched a candle from the table and proceeded down the passage, but found no living thing, and the doors were properly fastened. Returning to the dining room, I sat down to think, and came to the conclusion that I had been the victim of a trick of the brain, and laughed at my own folly. But when a quarter of an hour later I went upstairs to my bedroom, I experienced an unaccountable and absolutely unusual feeling of nervousness. The next day, my first impulse was to tell my wife of the remarkable incident of the night previous, my second to do nothing of the sort but keep it a locked secret in my own breast. A week later, my daughter Phyllis had been with me in the library. She was a clever shorthand writer, and had been taking some important letters down from my dictation. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed out midnight, I told her to cease work and go to her bed. She wished me good night and trotted off. A few minutes passed. Then the door of the library was flung violently open, and Phyllis, half fainting, looking ghastly pale, and with a scared-to-death appearance of face, rushed in and clung wildly to me. "What's the matter, child? What's the matter?" I cried in alarm, but she remained speechless. Moments, perhaps minutes, slipped by, during which I kept urging her to speak. She found her voice at last sufficient to jerk out in a breathless way, "Oh, Pa, I've had such a fright. When I got up to the first landing, such a strange-looking man was standing there. I was about to ask him what he was doing, when he raised his hand in a sort of warning way and disappeared." I laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh, and I pretended to speak lightly, as I said, "My dear child, I've been overworking you, and your poor tired brain has seen visions. Come, let me take you upstairs to your room. You must try and get a good night's rest. You will be all right tomorrow." She gave me a look that was full of meaning. She said with her eyes as plainly as possible, "Don't try to turn it off in that way. I have seen what I have seen." She had mastered her feelings by this time, and though she spoke no words, she went upstairs with me until we reached the first landing, which was lighted in the daytime by a long stained-glass window. Edging a little closer to me, she whispered, "This was where I saw him." "Nonsense, nonsense," I answered, though I was far from believing it was nonsense, but I wanted to reassure her. I escorted her to her door, saw that her lamp was burning, then kissed her good night and descended, and as I went down the last flight of stairs I turned suddenly, for I was sure I heard footsteps, and close behind me was a weird-looking man dressed in the costume of a gentleman of Charles II's reign. He appeared to be about 65 years of age. Long, grey, ringleted hair hung about his shoulders. His face wore an expression of awful anguish. For a moment I experienced a shock, but I quickly recovered myself and tried to grasp him. But he was as unsubstantial as the air, and the uncanniness of the whole business made me involuntarily shrink back. Then he raised his hands and, drawing down the large lace collar from his neck, he bared his throat, showing me a tremendous gash that had severed the windpipe, and from which the blood seemed to pour in a stream. It was a fearsome sight, I must confess, and I'd never before in the whole course of my existence experienced such an utterly gone and helpless feeling as I did in the presence of that supernatural visitant. And before I had pulled myself together, as the saying is, the weird spectre raised his hand, pointed upward with an extended finger, and in an instant had disappeared. I returned to my library and flung myself into a chair, and I asked myself seriously whether the incidents of the last quarter of an hour were not the result of some morbid condition of my own brain. That is to say, I was disposed to doubt whether my daughter had really rushed pale and fainting into the room as I've described, or whether it wasn't a figment of my own imagination. But here let me say that I had always been regarded as an unimaginative person, with, as I have said before, a scientific mind, which required hard, stern facts to convince it. How was it, then, I had come to see visions? I asked myself this question and mentally argued the whole thing out, trying to explain away the vision. But firstly, there were the mysterious hand and the sliding panel, and now here was a man of a bygone age who had horrified me by showing me his throat gashed and rent and bleeding. I don't know really how long I sat revolving the problem in my brain, but I do know that I crept up to bed at last feeling terribly fagged mentally and physically. I slept far beyond my usual hour the following morning. My family had already breakfasted, but Phyllis came and sat with me and recounted her previous night's experiences. There was an unwanted paleness in her pretty face and a scared look in her eyes. I felt it wise not to say anything to her about what I myself had seen, but, moved by a sudden impulse, I said I was going up to London by the next train and would take her with me. It was no unusual thing for me to be called away from home at a moment's notice, so that my wife was not surprised. Phyllis expressed her delight at going, and 2 hours later we were seated in the Up Express. On arriving at our destination, I quartered Phyllis at the house of my sister, while I went to a hotel, where I was in the habit of staying when in town. The following day I called on an old and esteemed medical friend, a man not only eminent as a physician, but famous as an author of several erudite works dealing with all forms of mental disease. I detailed the experiences of myself and daughter to him, and he looked very grave and puzzled. But before venturing to express any opinion, he said he would like to see Phyllis. So I drove off at once to my sister's, and took Phyllis back with me, and without entering into any particulars, I simply remarked that I wanted the doctor to see her. She expressed surprise by her face, but remained silent. On arriving at the doctor's house, I requested her to tell him what she had seen, which he did in a plain, intelligent way. My friend appeared more than ever puzzled, and, having sent Phyllis out of the room, he delivered himself somewhat as follows. "Well now, my dear fellow, The facts of the case are these. Both you and Phyllis are more impressionable than you imagine, and you have gone through a great deal of excitement lately in connection with your new quarters. Last night you overtaxed the girl's brain, and what she thought she saw was a pure fancy. Her sudden appearance in your room in a state of nervous agitation, her story, her manner, made a great impression on you, and what she told you she had seen suggested the same thing to you. But how about the hand and the sliding panel? I asked. The result also of a morbid condition of the mind, he answered. Fancy, fancy, all fancy, my dear sir. Now, you and Phyllis go and make a little journey somewhere, a trip to the south of France. A month at Monte Carlo will do you all the good in the world. I left my friend's house far from satisfied. I knew he was sincere in his belief, but he was wrong in his diagnosis. Nevertheless, I began to think of carrying out his suggestion and visiting the Riviera. No doubt I should have done that if it hadn't been for the fact that 3 days later I received a telegram from home summoning me back at once as my wife had been taken ill. I began to fear now that Rislip was to prove a curse instead of a blessing to me, and depressed by an anxiety I had never known before, I caught the next train out. Phyllis, of course, accompanied me, and we reached Rislip about 10 o'clock at night. I learnt that my wife had had a fit. The cause nobody knew, but she told me. She had been sitting in the dining room alone when she felt a draught as I had done. Then, to her horror, she saw a deathly white hand sliding the panel back. Suddenly, a quaintly dressed man with a haggard, anguished face appeared before her, and, baring his throat, displayed it gashed and bleeding as he had done to me. She was conscious of uttering a loud, shrill scream of terror. Then all was blank, until she awoke to find a doctor attending her. As she finished telling me her story, she expressed great anxiety lest her brain was giving way, and she only grew calm when I assured her that I had seen what she had seen, and that Phyllis had also met the ghostly man on the stairs. My medical friend's theory would not now hold water, because my wife had been ignorant of my own and Phyllis's experiences, so that she was not influenced by a recital which might have set up a morbid set of conditions in her own brain. Up to this time, I had always regarded spiritualism so-called as abominable quackery, and it always made me angry when I heard of the antics and silly pranks which the spirits called up at the séances that the professional humbugs indulged in. But now, I myself had seen a spirit. My daughter had also seen it, and my wife had seen it. We all three claimed to be people of common sense, free from morbid taint, and not given to conjuring up bogies out of every shadow that came in our path. And yet, it seemed to me that the spirit that had made itself manifest unto us had behaved in a very idiotic way, for if it had a grievance, why did it try to frighten us all to death? Of course, the matter was too serious to be pooh-poohed with a scornful laugh and a sceptical toss of the head. The statement of 3 persons, not quite fools, could not be ignored. I began to feel deeply interested in the psychological problem that was suggested to me, and after much cogitation I mentally asked myself whether the ghostly visitor had any particular reason for pointing upward. Anyway, I was prompted to try and find out, and made my way to the top of the house, where there was a range of garrets. Here I began to pry about in a very inquisitive way, and after long and patient searching for I knew not what, I chanced to strike a portion of the wall in a back garret with a stick I carried, and was rather astonished to find that it gave out a hollow sound. I rapped it again, the same sound, but a yard on either side, and there was solidity. I lost no time in getting the assistance of 2 of my men servants. I simply told them that I had accidentally discovered what I believed to be a door, and, prompted now more by curiosity than anything else, I, with their help, tore off the paper, then a lining of canvas, then more paper, till we got to some wood that had once been painted. close examination revealed that it was a door, and not without considerable trouble we got it open, disclosing a deep recess. Lights were procured, and from out the recess we dragged a heavy mass of dusty and time-stained metal. It was apparently a bundle of lead, rolled up. We unrolled it, and brought to light a quantity of human bones, including a singularly well-preserved skull, to which a mass of hair still adhered. What my feelings were I will not attempt to describe. Of course the servants were amazed. I sent them to their duties, again cautioning them to say nothing at present of our find. My next step was to lodge information with the county police, and in due course the inevitable coroner's inquiry was held, but elicited nothing beyond the medical opinion that the bones must have been where they were found for generations. Whose bones they were no one could even conjecture. Why they had been wrapped in lead and hidden in the secret cupboard was no less inscrutable. The coroner's jury could return but one verdict. The remains were those of some person unknown, and how he had met his death it was impossible to say. The bones were ordered to be buried in consecrated ground, and with Christian burial, and that was done. At my own expense, I placed a slab over the grave, bearing this line, "Sacred to the memory of a stranger. Date of birth and death unknown." With the finding and burial of those bones, the spectre of Rislip Abbey departed, and troubled us no more. Now, the story I've told you is a true one. There is the independent testimony of my wife and daughter to corroborate mine. My theory is that in some far-off time a brutal crime had been committed, and the murdered man's body had been rolled in a sheet of lead and thrust in the secret closet. But while the murderers could confine his body, they could not confine his spirit. Though why, after so many generations had passed, I should have been selected to bring the matter to light, I know not, and cannot even possibly suggest a theory, nor can the mystery of the crime be cleared up. Who the murdered man was, and why he was murdered, will never be known until the secrets of all hearts are revealed in the burning light of the Judgment Day. The Corpse Light. My name is John Patmore Lindsay. By profession I am a medical man, and a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and member of the Royal College of Physicians, London. I am also the author of numerous medical works, the best known, perhaps, being How to Keep in Good Health and Live Long. I was educated at one of the large public schools, and took my degree at Oxford. I have generally been regarded as a hard-headed man, and sceptical about all phenomena that were not capable of being explained by rational and known laws. Mysticism, occultism, spiritualism, and the like only served to excite my ridicule, and I entertained anything but a flattering opinion of those people who professed belief in such things. I was pleased to think it argued a weakness of mind. I have referred to the few foregoing facts about myself because I wish to make it clear that I do not belong to that class of nervous and excitable people who fall a prey to their own fancies, conjure up shapes and scenes out of their imaginings, and then vow and declare that they have been confronted with stern realities. What I am about to relate is so marvelous, so weird and startling, that I am fain to begin my story in a half-apologetic way, and even now, as I dwell upon it all, I wonder why I, of all men, should have been subjected to the unnatural and unearthly influence. But so it is, and though in a sense I am only half convinced, I no longer scoff when somebody reminds me that there is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in our philosophy. But to my story, and when it is told, the reader can judge for himself how powerful must have been the effect of what I witnessed, when it could induce a man of my mental fibre to commit to paper so astounding a narrative as the one I now pen. It is about 20 years ago that I took up a practice in the old-fashioned and picturesque little town of Brinton-on-Sea. At that time there was no railway into Brinton, the nearest station being some 7 or 8 miles away. The result was the town still retained a delightful old-time air, while the people were as primitive and old-fashioned as their town. Nevertheless, Brinton was far ahead of its neighbours, and, though in a purely agricultural district, was enterprising and businesslike, while its weekly Tuesday market brought an enormous influx of the population of the district for miles around, and very large sums of money changed hands. Being the chief town of the parish, and boasting of a very curious and ancient church, and a still more ancient market cross, to say nothing of several delightful old hostelries, and a small though excellent museum of local curiosities, consisting principally of Roman remains and fossils, for which the district was renowned, it attracted not only the antiquary and the gourmand, but artists, tourists, and lovers of the picturesque, as well as those in search of quietude and repose. The nearest village was High Lee, about 3 miles away. Between the two places was a wide sweep of magnificent rolling down, delightful at all times, but especially so in the summer. Many an ancient farmhouse was dotted about, with here and there a windmill. The down on the seaside terminated in a high headland, from which a splendid lighthouse sent forth its warning beams over the fierce North Sea. Second only in conspicuousness to this lighthouse was an old and half-ruined windmill, known all over the countryside as the Haunted Mill. When I first went to live in Brinton, this mill early attracted my attention, for it was one of the most picturesque old places of its kind I had ever seen, and as I had some artistic instincts, and could sketch with, as my too flattering friend said, no mean ability, the Haunted Mill appealed to me. It stood on rising ground, close to the high road that ran between Brinton and High Lee. I gathered that there had been some dispute about the ownership, and, as is usually the case, the suckers of the harpies of the law had fastened upon it, so to speak, and drained all its vitality away after the manner of lawyers generally. The old-fashioned legal luminaries of the country were a slow-going set, and for over a quarter of a century that disputed claim had remained unsettled, and during that long period the old mill had been gradually falling into ruin. The foundations had from some cause sunk, throwing the main building out of the perpendicular. Part of the roof had fallen in, and the fierce gales of a quarter of a century had battered the sails pretty well to matchwood. A long flight of wooden steps led up to the principal door, but these steps had rotted away in places, and the door itself had partly fallen inwards. Needless to say, this mill had become the home of bats and owls, and, according to the yokels, of something more fearsome than either. It was a forlorn and mournful-looking place, anyway, even in the full blaze of sunshine, but seen in moonlight its appearance was singularly weird, and well calculated to beget in the rustic mind a feeling of horror, and to produce a creepy and uncanny sensation in anyone susceptible to the influence of outre appearances. To me, it did not appeal in any of these aspects. I saw in it only subject matter for an exceedingly effective picture, and yet I am bound to confess that, even when transferred to board or canvas, there was a certain grim suggestiveness of things uncanny, and I easily understood how the superstitious and unreasoning rustic mind was awed into a belief that this mouldering old mill was haunted by something more creepy and harrowing than bats and owls. Anyway, I heard wonderful tales at which I laughed, and when I learned that the country people generally gave the mill a wide berth at night, blamed them for their stupidity. But it was a fact that worthy and in other respects intelligent farmers and market folk coming or going between Brinton and Highley after dark preferred the much longer and dangerous route by the sea cliffs, even in the wildest weather. I have dwelt thus long on the haunted mill because it bulks largely my story, as will presently be seen, and I came in time to regard it with scarcely less awe than the rustics did. It was during the second year of my residence in Brinton that a young man named Charles Royce came home, after having been absent at sea for 3 years. Royce's people occupied Gorse Hill Farm, about 2 miles to the south of Brinton. Young Charlie, a fine, handsome, but rather wild youngster, had, it appears, fallen desperately in love with Hannah Trousell, who was a domestic in the employ of the rector of the parish. But Charlie's people did not approve of his choice, and, thinking to cure him, packed him off to sea. And after an absence of 3 years and a month, the young fellow, bronzed, hearty, more rollicking and handsome than ever, returned to his native village. I had known nothing of Charles Royce or his history up to the day of his return, but it chanced on that very day I had to pay a professional visit to the rectory, and the rector pressed me to lunch with him. Greatly interested in all his parishioners, and knowing something of the private history of most of the families in his district, the reverend gentleman very naturally fell to talking about young Royce, and he told me the story, adding, "Hannah is a good girl, and I think it's rather a pity Charlie's people objected to his courting her. I believe she would have made him a capital wife." "Has she given him up entirely?" I asked. "Oh, yes, and is engaged to Silas Hartrop, whose father owns the fishing smack, the North Sea Beauty. I've never had a very high opinion of Silas. I'm afraid he is a little too fond of skittles and beer. However, Hannah seems determined to have him in spite of anything I can say, so she must take her course. But I hope she will be able to reform him, and that the marriage will be a happy one. I really shouldn't be a bit surprised, however, if the girl took up with her old lover again, for I have reason to know she was much attached to him, and I fancy Charlie, if he were so minded, could easily influence her to throw Silas overboard." This little story of love and disappointment naturally interested me, for in a country town the affairs of one's neighbours are matter of greater moment than is the case in a big city. So it came to pass that a few weeks after Charlie's return it was pretty generally known that, even as the rector had suggested it might be, young Royce and pretty Hannah Trousell were spooning again, and Silas had virtually been told to go about his business. It was further known that Silas had taken his dismissal so much to heart that he had been seeking consolation in the beer pot. Of course, folk talked a good deal, and most of them sympathized with Silas and blamed Hannah. Very soon it began to be bruited about that Royce's people no longer opposed any objections to the wooing, and that in consequence Hannah and Charlie were to become husband and wife at Christmas. That was in about 7 weeks' time. A month of the time had passed, and the askings were up in the parish church, when one day there went forth a rumour that Charles Royce was missing. Rumour took a more definite shape a few hours later, when it was positively stated that 2 nights previously Charles had left his father's house in high spirits and the best of health to visit Hannah and walk with her, as she was going into the town to make some purchases. On his way he called at the Two Waggoners, a wayside inn, where he had a pint of beer and purchased an ounce of tobacco. From the time he left the inn, all trace of him was lost, and he was seen no more. Hannah waited his coming until long past the appointed hour, and when he failed to put in an appearance, she became angry and went off to the town by herself. Next day her anger gave place to anxiety, when she learnt that he had left his home to visit her, and had not since returned, and anxiety became alarm, when 2 and 3 days slipped by without bringing any tidings of the truant. On the night that he left his home, the weather was very tempestuous, and it had been wild and stormy since. It was therefore suggested that on leaving the Two Waggoners, he might have got confused when he reached the common, which he had to cross to get to the rectory, and as there were several pools and treacherous hollows on the common, it was thought he had come to grief, but the most diligent search failed to justify the surmise. Such an event as this was well calculated to cause a sensation, not only in Brinton and its neighbourhood, but throughout the county. Indeed, for many days it was a common topic of conversation, and at the Brinton weekly market the farmers and the rustics dwelt upon it to the exclusion of other things, and of course everybody, or nearly everybody, had some wonderful theory of his or her own to account for the missing man's disappearance. One old lady, who every week for 20 years had trudged in from a village 5 miles off with poultry and eggs for the Brinton market, declared her belief that young Royce had been spirited away, and she recommended an appeal to a wondrous wise woman, locally known as Cracked Moll, but whose reputation for solving mysteries and discovering lost persons and things was very great. Ultimately, Royce's people did call in the services of this ancient fraud, but without any result. And despite of wide publicity and every effort on the part of the rural and county police, to say nothing of 101 amateur detectives, the mystery remained unsolved. Charles Royce had apparently disappeared from off the face of the earth, leaving not a trace behind. In the process of time, the 9 days' wonder gave place to something else, and excepting by those directly interested in him, Charles Royce was forgotten. Hannah took the matter very seriously to heart, and for a while lay dangerously ill. Silas Hartrop, who was much affected by his disappointment with regard to Hannah, went to the dogs, as the saying is, and drank so heavily that it ended in an attack of delirium tremens. I was called in to attend him, and had hard work to pull him through. On his recovery, his father sent him to an uncle at Yarmouth, who was in the fishing trade, and soon afterwards news came that young Hartrop had been drowned at sea. He was out in the North Sea in his uncle's fishing smack, and, though nobody saw him go, it was supposed that he fell overboard in the night. This set the local tongues wagging again for a time, but even the affairs of Brinton could not stand still because the ne'er-do-well Silas Hartrop was drowned. So sympathy was expressed with his people, and then the affair was dismissed. About 2 years later, I received an urgent message late one afternoon to hasten with all speed to High Lee, to attend to the squire there, who had been taken suddenly and, as reports said, seriously ill. I had had rather a heavy day of it, as there had been a good deal of sickness about for some time past, and it had taken me several hours to get through my list of patients. I had just refreshed myself with a cup of tea, and was about to enjoy a cigar, when the messenger came. Telling him to ride back as quickly as possible and say that I was coming, I busied myself with a few important matters which had to be attended to, as I might be absent for some hours, and then I ordered my favourite mare, Princess, to be saddled. I set off from Brinton soon after 7. It was a November night, bitterly cold, dark as Erebus, while every now and then violent squalls swept the land from seaward. Princess knew the road well, so I gave the mare her head, and she went splendidly until we reached the ruined mill, when suddenly she wheeled round with such abruptness that, though I was a good horseman, I was nearly pitched from the saddle. At the same moment, I was struck in the face by something that seemed cold and clammy. I thought at first it was a bat, but remembered that bats do not fly in November. An owl, but an owl would not have felt cold and clammy. However, I had little time for thought, as my attention had to be given to the mare. She seemed disposed to bolt, and was trembling with fear. Then, to my intense astonishment, I noticed what appeared to be a large, luminous body lying on the roadway. It had the appearance of a corpse illuminated in some wonderful and mysterious manner. Had it not been for the fright of my mare, I should have thought I was the victim of some optical delusion, but Princess evidently saw the weird object and refused to pass it. So impressed was I with the idea that a real and substantial body was lying on the road, notwithstanding the strange unearthly light, that I slipped from the saddle, intending to investigate the matter, when suddenly it disappeared, and the cold and clammy something again struck me in the face. I confess that for the first time in my life, I felt a strange, nervous, unaccountable fear. I say unaccountable because it would have been difficult for me to have given any explanation of my fear. Why, and of what was I afraid? Now, whatever the phenomenon was, there was the hard, stern fact to face that my horse had seen what I had seen, and was terrified. There was something strangely uncanny about the whole business, and when a terrific squall, bringing with it sleet and rain, came howling from the sea, it seemed to emphasize the uncanniness, and the ruined mill, looming gaunt and grim in the darkness, caused me to shake with an involuntary shudder. The next moment, I was trying to laugh myself out of my nervousness. Princess and I mentally argued, have been the victims of some atmospheric delusion. That was all very well, but the something cold and clammy that struck me in the face, and which may have struck the mare in the face also, was no atmospheric delusion. With an alacrity I did not often display, I sprang into the saddle, spoke some encouraging words to the mare, for she was still trembling, and when she bounded forward and the haunted mill was behind me, I experienced a positive sense of relief. I found my patient at High Lee in a very bad way. He was suffering from an attack of apoplexy, and though I used all my skill on his behalf, he passed away towards midnight. His wife very kindly offered me a bed for the night, but as I had important matters to attend to early in the morning, I declined the hospitality, though I was thankful for a glass or two of generous port wine and some sandwiches. It was 12:30 when I left the house on my return journey. The incident by the haunted mill had been put out of my head by the case I had been called upon to attend, but as I mounted my mare, the groom, who had brought her round from the stable, said, "It'd be a bad night, Doctor, for riding, the kind of night when dead things come out of their graves." I laughed and replied, "Tom, lad, I am surprised to hear you talk such rubbish. I thought you had more sense than that." "Well, I tell you what, Doctor, if I had to ride to Brinton tonight, I'd go by the cliffs and chance being drowned rather than pass yon old mill." These words for the moment unnerved me, and I honestly confess that I resolved to go by the cliffs, dangerous as the road was in the dark. Nevertheless, I laughed at Tom's fears and ridiculed him, though when I left the squire's grounds I turned the mare's head towards the cliffs. In a few minutes I was ridiculing myself. "John Patmore Lindsay," I mentally exclaimed, "you are a fool. All your life you have been ridiculing stories of the supernatural, and now, at your time of life, are you going to allow yourself to be frightened by a bogey? Shame on you." I bucked up, grew bold, and thereupon altered my course, and got into the high road again. There had been a slight improvement in the weather. It had ceased to rain, but the wind had settled down into a steady gale, and screeched and screamed over the moorland with a demoniacal fury. The darkness, however, was not so intense as it was, and a star here and there was visible through the torn clouds. But it was an eerie sort of night, and I was strangely impressed with a sense of my loneliness. It was absolutely unusual for me to feel like this, and I suggested to myself that my nerves were a little unstrung by overwork and the anxiety the squire's illness had caused me. And so I rode on, bowing my head to the storm, while the mare stepped out well, and I anticipated that in little more than half an hour I should be snug in bed. As we got abreast of the haunted mill, the mare once more gibbed and all but threw me, and again I was struck in the face by the cold, clammy,
something. I have generally prided myself on being a bold man, but my boldness had evaporated now, and I almost think my hair rose on end as I observed that the illuminated corpse was lying in the roadway again. But now it appeared to be surrounded by a lake of blood. It was the most horrible, weird, marrow-curdling sight that ever human eyes looked upon. I tried to urge Princess forward, but she was stricken with terror, and wheeling right round, was setting off towards Highley again. But once more I was struck in the face by the invisible something, and its coldness and clamminess made me shudder, while there in front of us lay the corpse in the pool of blood. The mare reared and plunged, but I got her head round, determining to make a wild gallop for Brinton and leave the horrors of the haunted mill behind. But the corpse was again in front of us, and I shrank back almost appalled as the something once more touched my face. I cannot hope to describe what my feelings were at this supreme moment. I don't believe anything human could have daunted me, but I was confronted by a supernatural mystery that not only terrified me, but the mare I was riding. Whichever way I turned, that awful, ghastly object confronted me, and the blow in the face was repeated again and again. How long I endured the unutterable horrors of the situation, I really don't know. Possibly the time was measured by brief minutes. It seemed to me hours. At last, my presence of mind returned. I dismounted, and reasoned with myself that, whatever the apparition was, it had some import. I soothed the mare by patting her neck and talking to her, and I determined then to try and find a solution of the mystery. But now a more wonderful thing happened. The corpse, which was still made visible by the unearthly light, rose straight up, and as it did so, the blood seemed to flow away from it in great, gurgling streams, for I solemnly declare that I distinctly heard gurgling sounds. The figure glided past me, and a sense of extraordinary coldness made me shiver. Slowly and gracefully, the shining corpse glided up the rotting steps of the old mill and disappeared through the doorway. No sooner had it gone than the mill itself seemed to glow with phosphorescent light and to become transparent, and I beheld a sight that took my breath away. I am disposed to think that for some moments my brain became so numbed that insensibility ensued, for I am conscious of a blank. When the power of thought returned, I was still holding the bridle of the mare, and she was cropping the grass at her feet. The mill loomed blackly against the night sky. It had resumed its normal appearance again. The wind shrieked about it, the ragged scud raced through the heavens, and the air was filled with the sounds of the raging wind. At first, I was inclined to doubt the evidence of my own senses. I tried to reason myself into a belief that my imagination had played me a trick, but I didn't succeed, although the mystery was too profound for my fathoming. So I mounted the mare, urged her to her fastest pace, galloped into Brinton, and entered my house with a feeling of intense relief. Thoroughly exhausted by the prolonged physical and mental strain I'd endured, I speedily sank into a deep though troubled slumber as soon as I got into bed. I was unusually late in rising the next day. I found that I had no appetite for breakfast. Indeed, I felt ill and out of sorts, and though I busied myself with my professional duties, I was haunted by the strange incidents of the preceding night. Never before in the whole course of my career had I been so impressed, so unnerved, and so dispirited. I wanted to believe that I was still as sceptical as ever, but it was no use. What I had seen might have been unearthly, but I had seen it, and it was no use trying to argue myself out of that fact. The result was, in the course of the afternoon I called on my old friend Mr. Goodyear, who was chief of the county constabulary. He was a strong-minded man, and, like myself, a hardened skeptic about all things that smacked of the supernatural. "Goodyear," I said, "I'm out of sorts, and I want you to humour a strange fancy I have. Bring one of your best men, and come with me to the haunted mill. But first let me exact from you a pledge of honour that, if our journey should result in nothing, you will keep the matter secret, as I am very sensitive to ridicule." He looked at me in amazement, and then, as he burst into a hearty laugh, exclaimed, "I say, my friend, you are overworking yourself. It's time you got a locum tenens and took a holiday." I told him that I agreed with him. Nevertheless, I begged him to humour me, and accompany me to the mill. At last he reluctantly consented to do so, and an hour later we drove out of the town in my dog-cart. There were 4 of us, as I took Peter, my groom, with me. We had provided ourselves with lanterns, but Goodyear's man and Peter knew nothing of the object of our journey. When we got abreast of the mill, I drew up, and giving the reins to Peter, I alighted, and Goodyear did the same. Taking him on one side, I said, "I have had a vision, and unless I am the victim of incipient madness, we shall find a dead body in the mill." The light of the dog-cart was shining full on his face, and I saw the expression of alarm that my words brought. "Look here, old chap," he said in a cheery, kindly way, as he put his arm through mine. "You're not going into that mill, but straight home again. Come now, get into the cart, and don't let's have any more of this nonsense." I felt disposed to yield to him, and had actually placed my foot on the step to mount, when I staggered back and exclaimed, "My God! Am I going mad, or is this a reality?" Once again, I had been struck in the face by the cold, clammy something, and I saw Goodyear suddenly clap his hand to his face as he cried out, "Hello! What the deuce is that?" "Aha!" I exclaimed exultantly, for I no longer thought my brain was giving way. "You have felt it too?" "Well, something cold and nasty-like struck me in the face. A bat, I expect." "Bats don't fly at this time of year," I replied. "By Jove, no more, they do." I approached him, and said in a low tone, "Goodyear, this is a mystery beyond our solving. I am resolved to go into that mill." He was a brave man, though for a moment or two he hesitated, but on my insisting he consented to humour me, and so we lit the lantern, and leaving the groom in charge of the horse and trap, I, Goodyear, and his man made our way with difficulty up the rotting steps, which were slimy and sodden with wet. As we entered the mill, an extraordinary sense of desolation and ruin met our gaze as we flashed the light of the lantern about. In places the floor had broken away, leaving yawning chasms of blackness. From the mouldering rafters, huge festoons of cobwebs hung. The accumulated dust and dampness of years had given them the appearance of cords. And oh, how the wind moaned eerily through the rifts and crannies and broken windows. If ever there was a place on this earth where evil spirits might dwell, it was surely that ghoul-haunted old mill. The startling aspect of the place impressed us all, perhaps me more than the other 2. We advanced gingerly, for the floor was so rotten we were afraid it would crumble beneath our feet. My companions were a little bewildered, I think, and were evidently at a loss to know what we had come there for. But some strange feeling impelled me to seek for something, though if I had been asked to define that something, for the life of me I could not have done it. Forward I went, however, taking the lead, and holding the lantern above my head so that its rays might fall afar. But they revealed nothing save the rotting floor and slimy walls. A ladder led to the upper story, and I expressed my intention of mounting it. Goodyear tried to dissuade me, but I was resolute, and led the way. The ladder was so creaky and fragile that it was not safe for more than one to be on it at a time. When I reached the second floor and drew myself up through the trap, I am absolutely certain I heard a sigh. You may say it was the wind. I swear it was not. The wind was moaning drearily enough, but the sigh was a distinctive note and unmistakable. As I turned the lantern round so that its light might sweep every hole and corner of the place, I noticed what seemed to be a sack full of something lying in a corner. I approached and touched it with my foot, and drew back in alarm, for touch and sound told me it contained neither corn nor chaff. I waited until my companions had joined me. Then I said to Goodyear, "Unless I am mistaken, there is something dreadful in that sack." He stooped and placed his hand on the sack, and I saw him start back. In another moment he recovered himself, and whipping out his knife, cut the string which fastened up the mouth of the sack, and revealed a human skull, with the hair and shriveled mummified flesh still adhering to it. "Great heavens!" he exclaimed. "Here is a human body!" We held a hurried conversation, and decided to leave the ghastly thing undisturbed until the morrow, so we scuttled down as fast as we could and went home. I did not return to the mill again myself. My part had been played. Investigation made it absolutely certain that the mouldering remains were those of poor Charlie Royce, and it was no less absolutely certain that he had been foully murdered. For not only was there a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet inside, but his throat had been cut. It was murder horrible and damnable. The verdict of the coroner's jury pronounced it murder, but there was no evidence to prove who had done the deed. Circumstances, however, pointed to Charlie's rival, Silas Hartrop. Was it a guilty conscience that drove him to drink? And did the furies who avenged such deeds impel him on that dark and stormy night in the North Sea to end the torture of his accursed earthly life? Who can tell? The sea holds its secrets, and not a scrap of legal evidence could be obtained. But though the law declined the responsibility of fixing the guilt of the dark deed on Silas, there was a consensus of opinion that he was the guilty party. It was a mystery, but the greatest mystery of all was that I, the skeptic, should have been selected by some supernatural power to be the instrument for bringing the foul crime to light. For myself, I attempt no explanation. I have told a true story. Let those who can explain it. I admit now that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,